If you're unable to copy and paste, easy way to get there is if you go to safe.com and do a search for FME training. It's the third result down here, FME training course resources, where you'll find links to all of our training manuals. So of course we are in the FME Server Administration. We'll be working off a Git book version of the training manual, so you can download a PDF, Mobi, or EPUB to read on your tablet, or if you select the read button, you can view the training manual in line here. So if I could get a show of hands, there's the control panel for GoToMeeting on your right-hand side of the screen. It will open up by default. There's a raise hand icon there. So if you've taken any training, any of our FME training courses before, can you please raise your hand now? Okay, so it looks like quite a number of you have taken the training, which is fantastic. So if you're unfamiliar with GoToWebinar, the control panel on your right, we have that raise hand button if you've found it. From time to time, we'll ask questions just to gauge where people are at and other type poll questions. There's also a chat window there. In that chat window, you can ask any question to myself. I'm Rylan Masjack. I work on the FME server support team, which is a great thing, I think, if you have any FME server questions. And sitting next to me, helping out with questions, is Laura Wu, also a member on the FME server experts team. So this course will run for 2 days, approximately 8:30 a.m., and we have scheduled until 11 a.m. We'll take a 10-minute break, approximately 1 hour in, stretch, get some water or coffee. And then at the end of the day, we'll break at an appropriate time such that the content is roughly equal for the amount of information that everyone will be sponging up. So listed in the course requirements, but not an actual requirement, I'll say, is the FME Server Authoring Training course. If you have not taken that course, don't fret. You won't be completely lost, but if you have taken that course, you will have a leg up on every other attendee. So I guess that's a good time to just quickly establish the distinction between the FME Server Authoring course and the Administration course. The Authoring course is all about learning how to use FME Server in your organization for its workspace options, its scheduling options, its notification system. All of that is covered in our Authoring course, whereas the Administration course kind of takes a step back and puts you in a different role where you're actually installing FME Server, maintaining FME Server, also doing some post-installation configurations. So without further ado, I think let's get started on the content. I hope everyone has launched their Amazon EC2 instance. If you are having any troubles connecting to your virtual machine, please let us know through the chat panel now. Just a reminder, if you've recently started your machine, they take approximately 10 minutes to start up, run some initial configurations and checks. So you may not be able to log in for approximately the first 10 minutes after you receive that email with your details. So maybe I'll ask one more question before we get started. How many people here are working with FME Server 2017.0 or .1, or for the brave, working with the FME Server 2018 beta. You just select that raise hand button. Okay, so I do see quite a few hands, not quite as much as before. So where there are differences between FME Server 2016, or perhaps I should say FME Server 2017 and previous, I'll try to highlight those changes. The installs we are working with are FME Server 2017.1. So this training manual has been divided into 7 sections arranged in what we think is a logical order. First, we'll discuss the options for planning your FME server installation, going over installation types. We'll work on some FME server connectivity. This is mostly just discussing firewalls, ports. You can see the topics listed here on the table of contents. We'll look at some scalability and performance, how we can scale out FME server and increase its performance. I think that's where we'll find our first exercise of the day. We have a chapter here which has a combination of a few different topics: FME server customization and the enterprise. We also will discuss migration and upgrades of FME server and go over some best practices. We'll highlight some of the FME server security options you have, and then a final bit on troubleshooting. So this troubleshooting section might serve as a handy tool for reference in your future work with FME server. All right, that is all the legal mumbo jumbo, if you wish to read it in the About This document. And right, so we do say it is recommended to have completed the FME server authoring course. If you have completed the FME desktop and FME server tutorials available on the FME Knowledge Center, that is fantastic. I think that having completed these materials ahead of time will help you understand some of the concepts that we discuss. If for any reason you would like some clarification, please do not hesitate to ask a question, especially for questions we see coming up quickly or multiple times. We will make sure to announce them over the GoToWebinar audio. We also do mention that knowledge of enterprise level security and IT configurations is helpful. So we will be discussing some of the concepts, particularly, I'd say, with the port access and firewalls. I'm not going to claim to be an expert in IT. There are probably many of you who have knowledge that exceeds my own. So for those of you who are experts in that field, please bear with me as I discuss some of these concepts. And there is just a note to the bottom here that we have configured these Amazon EC2 machines with a few extra things. If you try to run this training course on your own machine, please be aware that some of these configurations may not be available for you. All right, let's get started on Chapter 1. Planning an FME server installation. So one quick note, FME Workbench, which is part of the FME desktop product, is required for authoring and publishing or pushing workspaces up to FME server. If you don't have FME desktop installed, you still can interact and test your installation of FME server. However, if you want to start having your workspaces automated or accessible by multiple people, you will need to have an FME desktop installation. These training machines have an FME desktop 2017.1 installed for you to use. So we do often get the question, how does FME handle grid shift for coordinate system translations? The same as it does for desktop, and this is also for third-party applications. It goes hand in hand. If you have to perform any sort of configuration on your machine where you run FME desktop, be it installing ArcGIS or Oracle clients to get access to an extended variety of formats or transformers, you will also have to perform those same configurations on the machines hosting FME server. I do say machines because this will apply for the core and possibly engines, depending on which application. So there are three main types when you open up the FME server installer. You have your express install, which is your quick run through on this installation wizard, get FME server up and running. We provide all the components necessary. You don't really have to think about it too much. Express installs are great for active-active failover deployments and also for development and testing type environments. We offer the custom or distributed FME server installation, which provides you with the control over where components are installed to, so you can use what we term an N-tier installation. So you can split out some of the FME server components. We have a couple diagrams here how this is commonly achieved. So we use the terminology 3-tier or 2-tier architecture commonly, splitting up FME server into its presentation tier. This is the web application server, and then an express install of FME server. This is PostgreSQL. This is the web interface, the application, the web services, the clients of FME server. There's the application tier, which will host the FME server core or FME engines. Quick note that the FME engines themselves do not have to be on the same machine as the core. They can be split out onto their own. And then we have the data tier, where an FME server database must be supplied. In the express installation of FME server, that is where we use PostgreSQL. The web application is Tomcat. I made a mistake there. Tomcat is our presentation tier supplied with the express install of PostgreSQL, the database supplied for the data tier. If you do a distributed install of FME server, you must supply your own database. While we do offer the option to have a standalone installation of the default Tomcat web app server, we do not offer the same for a standalone FME server database. That must be configured by yourself if you're doing a distributed installation. And we have the third option here, the engine-only install. If you are expanding your engine network on FME server, you can select this to install only the FME engine on other machines. This option is also useful for if you choose to upgrade only the engines. So we will be talking a lot about the FME server architecture, and just to highlight the different components that I'll be speaking of, the FME server clients include the web services. So this is all your data translate. This includes your data translation services, your job submitter, data download, data streaming. Clients also include the web interface. So this is actually how your end user will be interacting with FME server. And we also lump in some of the non-web clients of FME Server, such as the console. Even FME Workbench can be considered a client of FME Server, the way it connects, and the FME Server REST API. So a client, of course, just our way to interface with FME Server. And components that are part of this application tier, part of the FME Server core, include a variety of different processes that run, including the process monitor for the engine and core. We have a repository management, the database, file system we can consider a component, FME engines, and then the various things here, scheduling manager, our relay manager, notifications, and WebSockets. So this is a high-level diagram of the FME Server architecture. I understand that this diagram will be going through an update soon, so this is the general picture won't change, just some of the arrows. There's going to be some additional arrows in the news diagram. We have our clients sitting over here, FME Workbench, the console, other custom applications. They all interact through the FME Server REST API. You'll notice that the FME Server web interface also hits that REST API to get its information. In this web application tier here, you also have the interaction with the web interface on these web services. You have the transformation services, which I had briefly mentioned, the job submitter data download. We also have other services, including utility services, that while are a core component of FME Server, an end user would not directly interact with them. However, they are vital in the background. So we have this whole client interface here talking to the FME Server components. We throw in this black bar here just to note, this is where you would probably want to have your layer of security implemented. Whereas this could all be public facing, this is where you'd probably start thinking about locking things down. The FME Server core handles all of the job management, FME workspaces, some of the core functionalities of FME Server, including scheduling and notifications. There's also a built-in software load balancer that will help if you have multiple FME engines. It will help direct your job requests to available engines. We have, as I mentioned, a process monitor both for the core and the engines. So it provides an element of fault tolerance for you. If the FME Server application itself or some of the supporting notification processes go down, the process monitor will attempt to restart these components for you. Similarly, for FME engines, if for any unforeseen reason an FME engine crashes, we have a process monitor process that will restart these engines for you. The FME engines here, you have a default of one engine comes with you when you purchase FME Server. However, this can be scaled out to as many engines as you want based on your processing power and number of available machines, of course. All the FME engines will have access to the file system or data sets. And the core and actually the engines will both be talking to the FME Server database, whereas the core also has to have access to the file system. That's for logging purposes. Right, so you can read about the components here in more detail. I believe I've covered the majority of this text here. So planning for fault tolerance. So we call fault tolerance, we interchange that sometimes with high availability. We understand that if you have FME Server installed to your production environment, many of our clients require that always on, and we have two ways to satisfy this. We have recovery, the concept of a recovery here, which I briefly had mentioned. We have the component recovery, which is this FME process monitor. There's one for both the engines and the core. So that means even on a single system, FME Server can restart components that fail automatically, seamlessly connect them back up to the core. There's also job recovery. So this is not discussing how FME engines will restart if they crash, but if a job is not completed for a certain reason, there is a parameter we can set to resubmit that job automatically. By default, the jobs will resubmit up to 3 times. However, you can tune this down or up as it needs to fit your practices. One important thing to note about job recovery is if you are writing to any databases, or if you use the feature writer transformer as an example to write data out midstream, resubmitting a job doesn't necessarily roll back or clean up after itself. So that is definitely something to be aware of, especially if you're writing to databases or have data being written out mid-translation. Actually, a very important gotcha we will see sometimes is when FME Server resubmits a job. So a job in FME Server is a workspace that's run. That's one translation that you've run in FME Workspace. If a job is resubmitted, the same log file name is used. So if I have my FME Server running, I submit a job, that's job ID 10, that job crashes. So I will have a partial log for that run. When that job is resubmitted, it's resubmitted as job ID number 10. It overwrites that existing log file. So the question becomes, all right, how do I know if my engine has ever resubmitted a job? That is recorded in the FME process monitor engine log file. So there are different ways we can access log files. I realize right now that while I will be following the manual here, I think it's important that I point out these things as I discuss them. So I'm going to navigate to my FME Server installation. If you are on your virtual machine, we just have that installed to localhost. Password and username is lowercase admin. So I'm going to give a quick example here. If I have a job running, I'm going to run my trusty Austin Apartments. This is my favorite way, by the way, to test an FME Server installation is by running the sample workspace Austin Apartments with data download. Specifically data download over the job submitter for one important reason. It produces a URL of the output data set for you to download. So if you run this workspace and it completes, that's great. However, if you cannot download the data set, then you will have something to investigate. So there we go. I verify that I can download that. So I can assume my FME Server, at least in terms of its engine component and its translation web services, they're in a healthy state. Right, so why did I do that? So I have job ID number 1. If I come in here, I look at the job log, it's going to show me the log for the most recent run. As I mentioned, the FME Server process monitor can resubmit jobs for you. How do you find out if they have been resubmitted? There's a log file. So logs can be accessed through the file system or through the web interface. On the web interface side, you can lock down who has access based on the FME Server account. For the file system, that's up to you to control those permissions. So I'm going to use the web interface to access the logs directory, and particularly in the engine current, this process monitor engine log. This is where you would look to see if you have any job that is perhaps behaving erratically, or you're noticing some duplicate data sets output. you may investigate this particular log file here. It will identify if any job has been resubmitted and also how many times it has been resubmitted. So that, without going too much on a tangent, this is a feature we are aware people are requesting. There's an idea in the Knowledge Center to identify in the web interface how many times a job has been resubmitted, if it has been. So we are aware that is a shortcoming, and I hope to see that in a future iteration of FME Server. All right, continuing along, that is recovery. Now let's discuss failover. Failover, that allows a single component or single points of failure on FME Server. However, having a system in place to ensure that those discrete points of failure don't affect the overall system health. So we have two basic approaches to that. We have what is termed the active-passive failover. So that's where you have two FME Server installations and they have a heartbeat established between them. If that heartbeat cannot be detected for a period of time, typically the heartbeat occurs I think more than once per minute. If it can't be detected for more than 1 minute, the failover operation starts to switch the direction from the web application tier over to the other FME Server core. For full failover operation to occur in an active passive environment, we're looking at roughly 3 to 5 minutes. This doesn't cover short interruptions like network interruptions. The other type of failover that we have is the active-active failover. That's where you have two full FME Server installations which are effectively independent of each other. They have their own file system, their own database, their own web tier, their own application tier, and you have a third-party load balancer sitting on top. So that way, if one of these systems goes down, you have the traffic just redirected automatically to the other system, which is still healthy. You can implement this with, we see clients doing this with Nginx or Amazon Web Services as well. So right, yeah, active-passive. Active-passive is two FME Server installations. However, they can share the same database and file system. They're simply just two separate FME cores and or FME engines, whereas active-active is completely separate. We do have a table down here that kind of highlights this. So active-passive, you have a big advantage there because your system is considered to be one system. If you publish a workspace, you create a schedule, it's available for both instances. In the active-active style architecture, it's not the case. They are separate installations, so you have to implement some sort of automated backup and restore to keep the two systems in check. And of course, that can be automated with FME Server itself. So this diagram highlights the active-passive architecture. You have your clients accessing FME Server through the web application server. Quick note, the fault tolerance on the web or presentation tier and the data tier, that is to be handled by the client or customer themselves. So while we can provide fault tolerance for the application tier of the FME Server core and engines, providing a proper fault tolerant web server as well as file system and database is passed on to the client. So the idea here is that you have one web server is connecting to your healthy core, It's also connecting to your file system. Your healthy core is connecting to your database. Failover event occurs, all these solid lines switch over to these dotted lines here. So your web application tier simply points to the new core. None of your IPs change, all the host name stays the same. And that core can have its own host of FME engines, and it will reestablish or create a new connection to your file system and database. The more you spread out these components, the better prepared for disaster scenarios you are. Which brings us in to planning for disaster recovery. So whereas fault tolerance, the concept of the recovery and failover, this is to ensure that systems are close to that always on, kind of 24/7, 99.99% up. If, however, it's not as important for your practices, your business, your client, you may consider that maybe you just plan for disaster recovery, which effectively is sort of like an active-active installation where you have two separated data centers, perhaps they're geographically separated, full FME server installations, and then you run through this backup and restore on schedule so that if one system goes down between a backup and restore operation, perhaps you lose only hours. You'd measure your downtime in hours for this disaster recovery to days, depending on the practices you have implemented. Whereas for your fault tolerance, you're looking at minutes to have full recovery of FME server. One advantage of working with distributed systems are for security updates. So it is important to note, of course, our developers, our team is very aware of all of the updates to every supporting component, including our Tomcat application, our Postgres database, other third-party libraries that we use. They are regularly updated. If you perform an express installation of FME server, or if you use our provided web application server, please be aware that to obtain security updates, generally it does require a full reinstall of FME server. If you are able to distribute your FME server environment and to have these components managed on your own, you have better control over how and when you can apply updates. All right. Last part of the planning an FME server installation chapter here, licensing. So for those of you who are not on FME Server 2016 or newer, this will be hopefully a big relief for you. Previously, FME Server 2015 and earlier, we relied on the FlexNet or FlexLM technology to serve floating licenses, which could be served either from the same machine hosting the core or any other machine. Now for FME Server 2016 and newer, we have a different licensing method where the FME Server core now provides licenses for the FME engines. So if you have your licensing files will sit with your FME Server core. They're accessed via the file system. So I suppose that means the license files could be contained in your file system. Your core connects to those license files and it serves it out to any FME engine that tries to connect to your FME server. So we hope that this reduces the overhead considerably when licensing an FME server instance. It's also really easy. It's done over HTTPS. So you simply install FME server, you open up the web interface, you go to the engines and licensing page noted here, and you click request license. No more emailing the support team or the codes team and waiting for a response back. You simply click the request license button, fill out your name and email, as well as your serial number, and then click OK. 8 to 10 seconds later, you get your license. Of course, some instances, some installations of FME Server are not connected to public internet. So there is an offline option available for you. There's a radio button here to select no, do not use automatic licensing from the internet. In this case, you will be presented with a JSON file downloaded locally, and you can send that JSON file to this email here, codes@safe. There's an automated process, which we love to say FME is running in the background. An automated process will return a valid license file for you, and you can transfer it back to the machine, again, not using public internet, and then it's a simple drag and drop to install that license. FME Server installations still are machine locked for the license file. So that will depend on the core. If you move your FME Server core, you likely will have to request a new license. However, that process itself still is streamlined. You simply just have to install your FME Server installation to a new machine, request the license. It will then update our system and validate the old license. If you require a temporary license for upgrade purposes, of course, if you want to move machines or upgrade versions of FME Server, please contact your account manager, and they will be able to set you up with a temporary serial number for testing purposes. FME Server also has a, I don't want to say built-in, but there's a default 7-day evaluation license. So if your testing period is under 7 days, then you don't have to worry about contacting us. You can simply just request that evaluation license. For new users of FME Server, they will be sent an email, and just simply responding to that email, clicking a button allows you to extend that trial license to 60 days. And that, of course, is a fully licensed, fully operational installation of FME Server. So that concludes the first chapter about planning an FME Server installation. I hope you learned a few things. Key points are FME workspaces are a part of FME Desktop, not FME Server. If you want to publish your workspaces up to FME Server, it requires FME Desktop. FME Desktop does not need to be installed to the same machine as FME Server for any of the functionality. FME Server has different installation types. You have your express, your distributed, your engine only, and one I did not mention was the silent installation. So for those environments where you have automated deployments of FME Server, perhaps you utilize Amazon EC2 instances to expand your capacity on demand. You can use silent install, so that's just command line install. After every installation of FME Server, you have actually that's only on Linux. On Linux, it provides you with the silent install command line. For Windows, we do have documentation available on the different parameters and flags that you can set for your installation. We have distributed installations. We typically see them in the 2 or 3 tier. That was the application tier, the presentation tier, and data tier. We provide recovery, fault tolerance through recovery. So that was the process monitor and job resubmits. You can also configure your FME Server installation if you plan ahead for failover. If you think you might be doing any post-install configurations of FME Server, especially if you're looking at potentially doing failover components, you might look to starting with a distributed install of FME Server. All right, so that important note about security updates there. So for standalone FME Server, they are dependent on updates to FME Server releases. If you wish to manage your own security updates, please install and connect to your own components. And then, yes, so the new updated licensing method for FME Server is just noted there. So I guess maybe we'll take a time here, Laura. How are the questions this morning? Do we have anything that's worth echoing out to the masses? Mostly, okay, so we have had quite a few questions, but it looks like most of them, for what it seems, appear to be quick, short answers here.
Yeah, a lot about machines themselves.
Yes.
Server, username, password, and that. So.
Yeah, there are, always the trials and tribulations of starting an FME server. Yes, Natalie is sitting in on this, and she mentioned on occasion these FME server instances that are generated on the fly with Amazon EC2 instances. Sometimes the install, for whatever reason, yet to be determined, is not as smooth as we wish. So if anyone has like a Connect to FME Server core, the first thing you can do is open up your Windows Services application here. And we found that the Postgres database often is unhappy with this procedure that we have specifically for these EC2 machines. And you can make sure that all 4 of your FME Server Windows services are running. So that's specifically the application server, core, database, and engines. Please glaze over FlexNet. This isn't related to FME Server. So don't worry, we're not pulling one over, not pulling something over your eyes here. FME Server does license itself now. So if you do have a cannot connect to FME Server core, you can also come into the start menu and restart FME Server this way. It should throw every component into its healthy state. So we will move on to the chapter on FME Server connectivity. And that is primarily dealing with firewalls and ports. So this is a cartooned version of the FME Server architecture diagram, which I mentioned will be receiving a revision just as we have more complex systems and more, especially lockdown systems. There are some discoveries, and especially with updates to FME Server, time to time, the way components talk to each other do change based on requirements. So I'll point out 2 resources here. We have the FME Server port documentation. So this will be your up-to-date documentation of what ports are used by which components of FME Server, which processes. So this is very important to know. We also, on the Knowledge Center, have an additional page. All right, so this will be so while this helps you identify which components, some people like to have that more well-defined for in and outbound rules. So we have this ports and executables and firewall exceptions. I'll chat this one out. So this will be a good Knowledge Center article. It's a living document. So we more on a fine-grained level here list all the inbound and outbound rules that you may want to configure if your system default is to deny all, allow some. We also have a specific note here if you have distributed FME Server engines. The initial connection between an FME Server core and an FME engine occurs over port 7070. Once that communication is established, we open a random port, a really high-level port in your 30,000 range that's open for dedicated communication, such that the 7070 port becomes available again if it needs to connect to another engine. This randomized port can be locked down to a specific range, and we have some text here that instructs how you can restrict that range to a set of ports. So for those environments where you must have allow none except these, this is where you would look to configuring that. So you can see here, just as a brief summary, we do have a variety of ports that are used for some of our notifications, so SMTP publishers, particularly email. Our database communications go over these two ports. 7082 is where we open up the port for a default FME server database. So this is the PostgreSQL database talking over port 7082. Typically, of course, that's, I believe, 5432. We have 7070 to establish that initial connection and the 7501 for the process monitor. We use 7071 to direct requests to the FME server core from the REST API. The rest of the notification services will communicate over ports 7072 to 76. We also have some of our utility services running over these two ports identified here. If you use WebSockets in any of your workspaces or with your FME server notification workflow, that by default is assigned to 7078, though I believe it can be modified. The port 7079 is for FME server resources and 7500 for the process monitor on the core. In our documentation for FME server, we do highlight this as well, all the different port communications. So I went to docs.safe.com, easy way to access FME server documentation. If you access it this way, this is the most up-to-date version of the documentation. You can also access it through the FME server web interface. And you'll notice here that this is a local copy of documentation. So it's particularly more important for older installations, especially older versions like FME Server 2016 or 2015. There can be a lot of major changes between functionality. So if you open the local copy of your FME Server documentation, you'll find the most relevant for your installation. So under the reference manual here, we have FME Server architecture, which has this friendly little diagram you've seen, annotated with all the ports and a bunch of letters to really drill down into what exactly everything is doing. And then that port listing, which was linked from the training manual itself. So in terms of DNS for your FME server, your host name, it's important to know the host name. If you're using an Express installation, you can use it localhost, as you see I've done here. If you are doing a distributed installation of FME server, you're going to need that host name information. For every component of FME server that you install must point to that same core host. And that's with your engine installations as well. Great tip down here, don't use localhost as your host name if you want FME server to be accessed remotely. Changing the host name for FME server isn't fully supported. If you need to change your host name and you have a distributed system, it likely will require reinstalling some of your components. The host name is buried in many different configuration files, and often if you try to change it manually, it'll kind of be the old fix one problem, two more appear. However, we do support changing the web server, the presentation to your host name after installation. That can be changed at any time. You can also move the web application server at any time to a new machine. A quick note about CORS, or cross-origin resource sharing. In FME Server 2017, we now have, by default, allow all. Previously in FME Server 2016 and earlier, it was to have CORS completely locked down, so it was deny all. The CORS settings for FME Server can be accessed by any FME Server admin under this admin here. So if I click on CORS, you'll see by default we do have all origins allowed, all methods, headers, etc. Excuse me. We do have templates that you can load, so you can allow specific hosts, and that just gives you an example of how you would organize your comma separated list. You could completely disable CORS as well, just by a couple clicks of the button. But just as a reminder, that allow all hosts is the default. CORS is particularly important when you start working with a web developer to create forms for an end user, or if you start to implement functionality of FME Server through its REST API into your own custom applications. And then we just go over some of the settings that you can set here and which headers and whatnot are assigned. So that chapter briefly just discusses port settings, DNS, and CORS. Great tip here. Yeah, firewall settings should not block FME Server ports. That's a pretty important to have there. That's definitely one thing to check. You have Telnet client, which is really handy for checking if particular ports are open. Of course, a lot more effective than just pinging a server. Host name issues often arise, and the key thing being there is, except for the web application, or if you put on any load balancer, that's fine. But if you want to actually change the host name which the engines are connecting to, if you're moving your core to another machine, that's where you start getting into some issues. And that's where we would rather see a reinstallation rather than manual configuration. So that, I believe, is a good point to stop for a break. When we come back, I promise that we will have something for you to do, not just listen. We have some exercises coming up in the FME Server Security chapter. So if you have any questions during the break, please do not hesitate to ask. We'll do the best we can to answer. Of course, we're going to be getting some coffee and water on our own. But if there are any great questions, I will make sure to echo them out to the wider audience. FME Server Security. So security for FME Server, we base that on two things: the users and roles. Users are the individual accounts that you would use to log in to FME Server. Users can have their permissions managed individually, or they can be part of larger groups, or roles as we call them. Of course, roles or groups make it easy to assign that same set of permission to multiple users. There are a default set of roles for FME Server that are included with every installation. So that is your FME super user. This account is required to do backups and restores, as well as import projects that contain users. So you definitely want to have at least one person assigned to the FME super user role, so they have that complete access for all the FME Server functionality. There's the FME admin role, so that effectively is the same as an FME super user. However, they do not have the backup and restore type permissions. We also provide an FME author role. So this has basic permissions that allow someone to publish a workspace from FME desktop to FME server, as well as create schedules and notifications, work with the basic core components of FME server. And then we have the FME user, which would be someone who just needs to log into FME server, upload some data, run a workspace. Nothing too complicated. And then there is the FME guest role. So this is a highly restricted role that doesn't have very many permissions and is used or can be used to provide unauthenticated but still restricted access to FME server's various web services. FME guest role is particularly useful when using or developing web applications where you're leveraging the FME server REST API. There are a few default user accounts created as well. We have the FME admin, which of course is also defined when you install FME server. So it perhaps may not match lowercase admin as presented here and available on these installations on these EC2 instances. The admin, though, by default is assigned both the FME super user and FME admin roles. Then we have the author, the user, and the guest roles. You're free to remove any of these or reconfigure them however you wish. It's important to note that they do come default to every FME server installation, and the default password is just the same as the username. So in FME Server 2017, we have better established the concept of ownership. If you've worked with any other web services, particularly things like Dropbox or Google, you're familiar with creating documents and having the ability to share out if you are the owner. Same thing applies for FME Server. We have, for example, on the repositories page here, we display a column of the owner, and if you are the owner there, you can click the share button and type in any other FME user or role, or if they have their email also listed in FME Server. This is particularly easier to do with Active Directory connections. Then you can easily share out any component or any item, I should say, in FME Server. And you'll see this owner and share column everywhere. Schedules, repositories, notifications. There's a better example there for notifications. So access is based on a variety of permissions here. We'll get into the security policies in just a moment. You can also assign ownership of something to another user if you are the owner. So I think I'll switch over to the next section here, security policies. Security policies are categorized into a variety of different spaces. We have a run workspace. The only option there, probably most people, you'll want to give the ability to run a workspace in FME Server. That's typically why we have it. There is an advanced option that allows you to give a user access to some of the other directives that are available, such as tagging engines for job queues, and also obtaining direct URLs to run workspaces. There are permissions for jobs. By default, every user will be able to, if you give them access, that is, to the jobs page, if you give them access, By default, they will be able to view the jobs they have run and cancel any of the jobs that are currently running or in the queue. If you grant the manage option, that allows a user to view the full job history, cancel any job, and remove any job from history. So in FME Server, if I go to the jobs page, as an admin user, I can show all completed jobs for any user on FME Server. I also see all the job history and where there's any queued or running jobs, regardless of the user that invoked the job, I can cancel it if I wish. That is with the manage permission. Schedule is one of the core functions of FME Server, also have permissions to allow access and creating or editing. For repositories, this is where we actually store our workspaces. It provides a means to categorize them as well. Each user can be given a different set of permissions for each repository. If you grant a user access to specific repositories, and if another user creates them, they're not automatically going to have those capabilities until it's either shared with them or the permissions are explicitly set. And you can set download, read, publish, run, remove. For FME Server notifications, so that's going to be your publications, your subscriptions, and your topics. They all have separate permissions. So while there is one general notifications page, you'll observe that there's a tab for publications, subscriptions, and topics. So access to which items, which objects can be controlled, and as well different capabilities, read, write, publish, remove. So resources, files and data sets that either reside in the FME Server file system, or by establishing connections, you can have also pointers at Amazon S3 buckets or network paths, such as like a UNC path. So important as well to restrict the access for some user groups. FME Server has a concept of connections for web services and databases. A database or web connection stores your credentials and encrypts it in a secure way so that you're able to share database and web service connections without sharing your credentials. By sharing one of these connections, you are sharing access. However, your credentials are encrypted and remain secure. Access to individual connection objects can be controlled as well. And the ability to create or duplicate these in FME Server. Projects are a new feature for FME Server. And the FME Server authoring course has a chapter dedicated to investigating how projects can be used. As an FME Server Administrator, projects are an important resource to know about, whereas you can do a full backup and restore operation of FME Server and gather all your components, clone it over to a new system. You can also create FME Server projects and migrate subsets or just single solutions in FME Server. And projects can contain any component of FME Server, be it workspaces, notifications, and users. Dashboards. This is a great way to view or analyze FME Server health. Dashboards in FME Server, there are 4 or 5 that we ship by default. They're not turned on either. And I think after I finish this section here, we can take a look at dashboards quickly. Or I'm looking ahead here. We do cover them. Actually, we'll cover them tomorrow in tomorrow's session. But we will look at how we can get some graphical reports about FME Server health. Engines and licensing, obviously an important security permission to grant there, because that allows changing the number of active engines, managing the connected hosts, so the host would be different machines that serve FME engines, as well as changing and requesting licensing itself. You have access to the security page itself. System cleanup tasks. We will discuss system cleanup tasks later on. So these are a bunch of kind of utility services that clean out any directories, temp directories. You could also set these up to purge old log files. And modification of FME Server web services. So that's your data download, job streaming, etc. All right, so let's jump into the first exercise here. This one previously was available in the FME Server authoring course. However, managing users is more of the administration task, so it's found its way into this training manual. So I'm going to work through exercise 1 of chapter 3, creating a new user. So I'm going to clean up my tabs here, and I'm going to open up a new one. You can work along with me or just watch. To navigate to HTTP localhost. That'll automatically redirect me to my FME Server application here. If you're logging in for the first time, please use the admin account. That's admin, all lowercase, for the username and password. We will drill into the security page under the admin heading on the left-hand side. And we're going to create a new user account. Perhaps we have a new analyst in town. We want to give them access to our server. So I'll click new. You can see all the required fields in bold. So I'm just going to call this new user. We can give them a full name if we want. Or we have to, I should say. You can create a user and the account doesn't have to be enabled right away. So that's a new feature for FME Server 2017. You can disable accounts without deleting them. So if you want to temporarily remove access, revoke access, you can do so without actually fully deleting. This is where you can enter in an email. So an email allows you to search and share that way as well. In FME Server 2018, we have the password recovery option available. So this will, of course, require the user to have an email address populated here. You can select existing roles in FME Server to assign permissions to. For our purposes, this exercise, we'll leave it blank for now. And of course, the password. So I'm just going to use new user 1 as shown in step 2. As I was speaking, I forgot which letter I was on. All right. So for configuring permissions, we do have a few templates that you can load here that effectively just copies the permissions from a role. This is different than assigning a user to a role. If you assign a user to a role, then you have to manage the permissions, or you can manage the permissions by role. Whereas if we load a template, we can take that base set of permissions and modify it to our needs. So I'm going to choose the FME guest role. Select OK. You can see pretty limited what they get. They can run a workspace and they can run jobs or access jobs. They can see the jobs that have run. Previous iterations of FME Server, you may be familiar with the ability to control access to the web interface itself. Every user account now by default has access to the web interface account. If you don't want them to have any type of access, then just make sure all these are deselected. Otherwise, they will be able to log in. We are going to add a few extra permissions here. Maybe we want to give our user the option to create schedules, to create repositories, and projects, that kind of compartmentalized FME server backup. So that's all I'm going to do. Hit OK. I will create that new user here. If you're ever working with security, you're creating roles, users, FME server, I'd recommend testing it out. I like to open a private window or incognito window, as they call it in Chrome, so I can have a fresh session with no cookies or cache to log into FME server. So just testing the account, that's step 4. You can see a much more limited menu here in our new user. They can still see all of the help options. However, the left-hand menu is limited to what they can do. They can still come in here, select a samples workspace. Maybe let's choose awesome download this time. They can run workspaces. They can see the jobs page, so they can see what they have running, what they've queued, what they've completed. So note here, I can only see that ID 2. I can't see that first Austin Apartments workspace that I ran. However, with when I'm logged in as my admin user, I can see both, and I can also select different options to filter what jobs I see. So I mentioned earlier, you can have a user account, which we refer to as a trusted user account, run FME server services without authentication. So that is, they're not prompted for authentication when they access something. This is particularly useful when you're building your own web applications. By default, this is the guest account, and it is assigned to the FME guest role. So if you want to remove this authenticated access to FME server web services, simply remove the guest and FME guest objects. The trusted user account is actually configured in a variety of properties files, which we like to call properties file.properties. There's one present for each web service. If your FME server has been installed using the default Tomcat, this is the path where you could find it. So this first path would be wherever you install your FME server. Then the utilities folder, that's actually where we have the web apps for Tomcat. And I can show us here. So I'm just opening up my file system on my C drive. We have our FME server installation in the apps directory. And in utilities, Tomcat, web apps, you can see all the variety of different web applications we have running. Most of these you cannot access directly. Of course, FME REST you can, FME token you're available. The others are just the services themselves. So if I tried to access them directly, it's not full functionality. So for example, in my job submitter, and then as indicated here in the manual, once you select one of your web service folders, you go into this web inf folder, into the conf folder, and you have these properties file.properties. Inside these folders or files, I'm just going to open this up with Notepad. You can see that down here we have the default username and password. So this is how we propagate that unauthenticated access. So you could change, if you'd like to assign to any other role than guest, you could have it here. So that means if someone tries to access FME server, based on which web service they're trying to access, so for this example, it's FME job submitter. First, FME will try to authenticate using the default user ID and password. If that is able to be satisfied, there will be no prompt for credentials. However, if in this case, the guest account doesn't have access, then you will be prompted for your credentials. Of course, that can be completely configured, what they have access to. Again, once this account is created, if you add additional items, objects to FME Server, the guest will not gain access by default. That has to be explicitly set. And if you wish to not have this account, simply delete it. Another important thing to note here, running the FME system services under a different account. So this is applicable particularly for Windows deployments of FME Server. By default, we install, for an express installation, those 4 FME Server Windows services. That's the core, the engines, the application server, and also the database. Most of them by default are geared to log in as the local system account. So I'm going to open up the services application here. If we look at the FME Server services, we can see they're all running as local system. That's fine and dandy, but if you are accessing any network resources, that likely will require the FME Server core and the FME Server engines to be modified. You'd have to come in here and change the account that runs the service. So that service account would have to have permissions to start up services, but also have to have the proper network permissions. This can be important when you're dealing with external databases in particular, and in any file share, I should say. The database itself, right now it's local to the core, so we don't have to worry about setting any special permissions there because all the traffic is local. Similarly, it is not common where we see the FME Server application server needing to have a different logon as configured. Typically, it is the FME Server core and the FME Server engines that require this. All right, so Active Directory and FME Server. So Active Directory in FME Server 2017, I'm so happy that it is so much easier than it has been in previous versions. In FME Server 2016 and previous, configuring for Active Directory can be thought of a configuration text file nightmare. We had a series of parameters that needed to be configured, and it was almost on the guess and check level where you would have to save your file, restart FME Server, see if the configuration worked. The other pitfall for configuring Active Directory in earlier versions of FME Server is it was one or the other. You either chose to manage your user accounts created in FME Server, or you chose to have accounts managed by your Active Directory. So that means you weren't able to create additional accounts in FME Server if you configured for Active Directory. You had to do so from your domain controller. Now in FME Server 2017, they coexist and live in harmony. Active Directory users and FME Server system users can exist at the same time. These users also can be part of the same FME Server role. So you can have an FME Server role that contains both Active Directory users and FME Server system users. You are able to import your Active Directory groupings. However, FME Server only has read access to Active Directory, so any group membership must be modified on your domain controller itself. Right, you can also connect to multiple domains, connect to multiple Active Directory domains for FME Server, so that's pretty powerful as well. You can have multiple Active Directory connections. Everything now, of course, is done in the web user interface. So under the admin menu, we have this Active Directory page where you can create a new connection, name, host, port. You have to enter in your domain search user in this format and their password. Just a user, it doesn't have to be a member of FME Server. They just have to be a user account on your domain that has access to list Active Directory. And then our usual supported encryption and authentication methods are available. Now, there also is a checkbox here to enable synchronization. As I mentioned, the management of Active Directory remains with the domain controller. So if you have synchronization enabled, then FME Server will pull the Active Directory connection, and any group memberships that have changed will be automatically updated. If you add any users to FME Server from your if you add any users to FME Server from Active Directory, that is an explicitly done step. So if you add new users to Active Directory, you must then still come into FME Server and add them as appropriate. On the users page here, we also have the search filter. So you're able to add multiple users to a role. So for example, I would be able to select multiple roles here. Say these were 2 Active Directory users I just imported. The type here would be listed as Active Directory. So whereas system denotes that it has been created in FME Server. And you can come here and add roles to these selected users. So that's really handy there for once you import your once you import your Active Directory users into FME Server, it's really easy to assign them to a role. You don't actually have to import the group that they're a member of. You can simply import the user. So that again is a little bit of a behavior change from previous versions of FME Server. We also do support integrated Windows authentication or single sign-on. So there is an option once you set up your Active Directory connection to enable single sign-on. That, of course, allows a user to log into FME Server without the need to type in their credentials. I believe there are, maybe some incompatibilities depending on your SSO authentication type. I know some people use dongles, some people use key cards. And if you have any issues, or if you notice that the feature isn't supported, please do contact us and let us know. I'll also quickly note, if anyone's working on FME Server 2017.0 and you have a large Active Directory listing, it's highly recommended to upgrade to FME Server 2017.1. There have been numerous performance upgrades with respect to adding and listing users and roles for those organizations that have large Active Directories, and we're talking on the order of thousands to 10,000s of users in their root list. That said, FME Server also allows you, when you create a connection, where is it here, to specify a search base. So if you can enter in a distinguished name here or a series of distinguished names, and that effectively allows you to drill down into your Active Directory tree and start at that branch and list all children of, rather than polling and listing your root. Gotcha for the search base is if the role is part of 2 branches, you need to list both branches for that role to be listed. So there is a page here on an exercise for configuring FME Server for Active Directory. I would love it if we were all able to do this, but unfortunately I couldn't give everyone access to our domain controller. I did create a video here for viewing where I created a simple Active Directory in Amazon Web Services. However, based on the security restrictions and requirements of our organization, we're unable to provide an Active Directory for everyone to connect to in this training session. So at the end of the session today, I encourage you to watch this video that demonstrates this exercise. Simply just, we connect to FME Server, we create a new Active Directory connection. It goes over the process of importing users into FME Server. Also demonstrating how you can assign security roles and configure user permissions, and then just does a quick verification testing the user account. I think the video is only 2 to 5 minutes in length, so again, I encourage you to watch this exercise. And I apologize for the requirements and restrictions that prevent us from doing a live participation demonstration of this Active Directory exercise. However, we can discuss and try HTTPS or SSL configurations with FME Server. We support both self-signed and certified authority issued certificates for FME Server. We will jump into exercise 3, where we will configure FME Server to use a self-signed certificate. I'll try to note out the point in the exercise where this would differ for those who have CA issued certificates. However, doing a self-signed closely works with the procedure. So this exercise is borrowed from our documentation. I'm just going to jump out and show you that. So under optimizing, securing FME Server security basics, we see our pages for HTTPS right there. I'll chat out this link too. And we will be working through the various steps here. So when we, under the working with a certificate, we will be following the self-signed certificate. And if you had your own CA issued, then there are a couple additional steps to be aware of. Okay, so this exercise is designed in mind that we don't want to just type. So every command here you should be able to just copy and paste most of these commands here. So the first thing I'm going to do is open up an administrator command prompt, which is important for this exercise. So if I right click on the Windows icon here, if you're working on these training machines, you can select the option to open command prompt as admin. So the first thing I'm going to do is navigate to the FME Server Java bin directory. And in here is a application called Key Tool, which we can actually use to generate a new key store file. So I'm going to copy and paste this command rather than typing it in. Let's see, I'll just make my window a bit skinnier so we can still see the instructions. Just right click to paste that in, hit return. So now it brings us through a series of prompts from the key tool. So the key store password I'm going to leave as Tomcat, just my alias, my file name, my password, all the same. Really easy for this exercise. So I just typed in Tomcat. My first and last name, this is where for a self-signed certificate you would want to enter in the host name of your FME server installation. In our case, on these training machines, that is just localhost. And then for these remaining parameters, I'm just going to hit return just to leave them unknown. So organizational unit, organization, city, state, 2-letter code. So then it shows you our string distinguished name here. Just type in yes. By default, no is selected there. So that will create now our key store file. It's going to create it in that Java bin directory. When prompted for the key password here, you can just enter return. It's going to be the same as our key store password. For self-signed certificates, once they're created, we want to copy this key store file from our Tomcat, from this Java bin directory to our Tomcat directory. So there is another command we can copy and paste here. So this will just copy the file from one directory to another, so easier for FME Server to reference it. And now that we have created this key store file, we actually have to import it into FME Server, into its key store for trusted certificates. So that again will be a key tool command that we invoke. And this is where working with certificate, this matches the same heading as I identified here in the documentation. So if you are using a CA issue, this is the step where it will differ. If you're working on the training machine with me here, we can copy this command and it will place it into that CA certs FME Server key store. And we type in our destination key store password, which is the super secure password of change it. We have not changed it. That's just noted right there. And then asks you for the password of the key store we just created. That was Tomcat. We note that again in the training manual. We get that success that it has been imported. So now that we have the certificate in there, the self-signed certificate is now trusted, we can actually configure FME Server to have the correct URLs. So there's a few steps that we need to do, modifying some Tomcat files. And to do that, let's go to our file system. I am on just above step 3 in the training manual here. So this is the directory that we'll be accessing. I'm actually just going to copy that and paste it into my file explorer here. So in here, there are 3 files in particular that we are going to work with. That is the server XML, web XML, and context XML. So as a best practice, you can create a copy of these. So it's up to you how you want to go about creating them. Maybe I'll just copy it for now, won't bother renaming. Always great to have a backup. First thing we'll do is edit the server.xml file. So it's important that we're in a text editor running as administrator. I like to use Notepad++, free, lightweight, easy to use. Also has your nice, pretty organization. So again, these instructions are taken from the documentation. The first thing we'll do is locate the SSL engine setting in the listener element. That's right here, line 28. And we want to change the value of on to off. Now, I would really like to stress that the structure of these files is not my expertise. The configuration Steps, determining them, are not my expertise. However, I am great at following steps, and I can instruct us and lead us along the way here. So if you have any specific questions, I mean, please don't hesitate to ask, but be aware that we will have to probably poll our developers for some of the nitty-gritty details. The next item that we want to look at is the connector. So this connector element here, starting at line 69. And we want to actually replace it. So let's navigate back. We want to replace it with this text block listed here under step 3. So I'm simply going to select this, copy it, and then you could just comment this out, but I've already created a backup, so I'm just going to one-to-one overwrite, paste that in, and you'll notice here that our redirect port is going to be 8443. So whereas we were connecting to FME Server over its default port 80 provided by Tomcat, we're changing this now to 8443. After those two changes are made, we can hit save. For anyone who is migrating an instance of FME Server, especially from an older version of FME Server, some of the ciphers are different. So if you are experiencing any issues with your SSL, please contact us, as one of the things that we will look to are the ciphers that have been defined here. So back to my file system is the web XML file that I would like to work with. Open that in my trusty notepad. And for this, we are just going to add a block of code right near the end. So just before the closing web app line on 4681, in the training manual under step 4, we have the series of tags here to copy and paste in. So again, just make sure that you're above the closing web app tag. That's all we need to do for web XML. You can save that file. Now on to step 5, the final context XML file configuration. Again, we are just going to add a new line here before the closing context tag under step 5 of the FME Server training manual. We have this short block here to copy and paste in. And I can save that. So those are all the changes that we need to make for Tomcat. Again, if you have a different web application server, this procedure may vary for you. I believe we're working with, I want to say Tomcat 9. Pretty sure. I think so.
More recent ones.
Yeah, but definitely one of the more recent ones. This is a very recent release of FME Server. So we need to first restart that Tomcat web application server. So if you open up your services application for Windows, if you're following along in our training manual, I'm going to select FME Server application server and restart. I am restarting one component here, so I do save the chance that I should have restarted the entire FME server, but logic determines we only modified the web app, so I'm going to try it out. If I navigate now to my FME server, I must specify port 8443. And let's see here. Maybe I need a full restart. Yeah, logic beat me. I'm going to fully restart FME server. I suppose the core needs access to that key file. The core did not know about it previously, as all these things are loaded on startup. All right, things are mostly up and running. Type in HTTPS localhost 8443. Moment of truth. Perfect. So this is what we would expect as we have configured a self-signed certificate. Our browser is telling us, hey, I do not recognize the issuer of the certificate. Be warned. So for our purposes in this training exercise, if your browser supports it, I'm using Google Chrome. We can click Advanced and we can proceed to localhost to get into FME Server. You'll notice up here in self-signed certificates, we have that warning that is not secure. I can log into FME Server now using my same admin credentials. And now the final step we have to do is actually changing the FME Server web service URLs, because now they are all HTTPS. So as an admin user, I can navigate on the left-hand menu under Admin, the Services page. You'll notice that all of these services still specify localhost, so if I tried to invoke any jobs, I would likely have a fail. I must select the Change All Hosts button, and this URL string is populated directly from our web browser. So you'll notice it is HTTPS. It is specifying port 8443. I can select OK, and that now updates all these URLs. As best practice, after any modification, we should test the health of FME Server. And how do we do that? My favorite, by running a sample workspace specifying the data download service. So job submission is working, the translation succeeds, and now my data download URL does have the correct URL string, and to confirm it still downloads, click the link, there we go. So I hope if you are configuring for HTTPS, you do experience such a streamlined and easy configuration yourself. There are some caveats with different types of certificate files, importing them into the key store. Some CA issued certificates we've noticed do require still to be imported into the FME Server's Java key store, as well as even if you already have it on your system Java key store. Do remember to restart your FME server, not just your web application server, if you configure for SSL. So that does conclude the chapter on FME server security. We discussed the concept of users and roles in FME server. The important note about that trusted user account, which by default provides unauthenticated access via guest-guest. If you already have FME server installed and you haven't deleted this account, don't worry, it is really locked down. It really doesn't have permissions for much at all. I don't know if it has permissions for any of the workspaces, really. You can also integrate your organization's Active Directory. So when we finish up the session for today, please go back to exercise 2, watch that video, see how easy and painless it is. That is in itself, if you're using Active Directory in 2016 or earlier, I think that in itself is an excellent reason to upgrade. I did note, if you are working in 2017.0, you may look to .1, the .1 release, for a lot of Active Directory improvements. Once we rolled out the Active Directory, we were using a different set of libraries and everything. So once it was out in the real world, there were some issues noted, particularly with large Active Directory listings that we had to create or fix, I should say. Important for the FME Server Windows services, particularly the core and engines, to be configured for a service account that has access to your network, your file shares, as well as your databases. That last one is particularly important, as often the service account doesn't have access for the database or has limited access for your external database if you're writing to any Oracle or ArcSDE type stuff. important to change. And we had that quick exercise demonstrating how FME Server can be configured for HTTPS to encrypt the communication between the client and core components. While we did configure for that self-signed certificate, you can configure for your own CA-issued certificate. So at the end of some of these chapters here, we do have, you may have noticed these little multiple choice questions, and the answers are listed at the end of each chapter. All right, so let's get started for today. Backup and migration. So backup and migration is very important for FME Server admins to be aware of. I think that creating backups on schedule is something that everybody should do as a best practice. It's also important to learn the ways of which the backup and restore procedure works for if you are to upgrade your FME server between versions, or if you're moving to another machine, or if you're doing multiple installs of your dev, test, and prod environments. I think it's very important to understand which components are migrated. And then we have that big header right here to highlight those things. Effectively is everything that you can access from the FME Server web UI, with some caveats I'll mention. Repositories are migrated, including everything stored in them. That's workspaces, custom transformers, formats, templates, and other resources. Of course, the FME Server services are migrated. That's your data download, job submitter, the settings that you have configured in the web interface. Your notification components, all your topics, subscriptions, publications, everything will be migrated there. Of course, security is migrated. And that's why it's very important that the backup and restore procedures are performed by the FME super user, as that is the only role that has the ability to export and import these users' roles tokens. This also will import Active Directory configurations. So if you have an Active Directory configuration created in FME Server, the requirement is that you have imported at least one user or role. Once you restore your FME Server configuration, those users and roles and Active Directory credentials will be transferred as well. Of course, schedules are transferred, and all these shared resources. So that's your data folder, your engine folder, but I will mention this again, not the job logs. The job logs are not migrated and must be manually backed up. And the final thing is, yes, all your database and web connections will be migrated as well. So the job logs won't be migrated. So what can you do? Well, there's two ways to go about that. You can come into the web interface, into your resources page, and then you can go into your logs folder, and then if there are any folders or logs in particular you would like to keep, then you would download them and place them in a secure location. If you want to do it through the file system, just having trouble with my window, there we go. If you want to do it through the file system, the FME Server installer will ask you where you would like to place the FME Server system share, and that's where the log files are placed. So by default, that is in the hidden folder, program data on the C drive, and safe software, FME Server. So you'll see a variety of files in here, but in particular, the resources, this logs folder is where you can drag to a different location. If you do not back up your log files first, when you uninstall FME Server, it will remove this directory. So please be aware of that. Right, so there is a workspace that you can schedule a backup of the FME Server configuration. and there is an existing schedule that's installed by default. So if I go to the schedules page of the web user interface, there's this backup configuration workspace. By default, it is disabled. So you would have to select this and enable it. If you've changed any of the credentials from admin, you will have to come into the schedule itself and make sure that you enter your server username and password. As you can see, the backups are by default saved to the shared resources folder. So that would be on our file system. They would end up in this folder here on my C drive. Of course, that can be written to any network or local path that you wish. If you are configuring an active directory, you can chain together a couple things to help keep your two systems in sync. If you had this backup configuration workspace running on a schedule, it would be placing a file every day or for whatever you set it for into this folder. If you change the directory to a network share, you could have your other system, your secondary system, have a directory watch notification that's watching for any new files that are placed in there, and you can schedule to have an import or an email sent out that you need to refresh the secondary system. I'm sure there's a lot of creative ways to do it. That's just what I thought of the top of my head now. It's all about trying to automate and just remove as much overhead, of course. It's also important to know that the configuration files are not backed up. They are not migrated. If you uninstall FME Server, these files will be removed. In particular, the configuration files are listed down here that you may interact with in this training course in particular. So we have a variety of configuration files that are listed in the FME Server installation directory and the server folder. So there's process monitor, config, and engines, or sorry, core and engines. There's a configuration file for the server in general, WebSockets, engine, and then the trusted FME common config. So if you've performed any changes to any of these files listed here, and that includes the server, web, and context XML files that we modified for our HTTPS configurations, if you change any of these files, you will want to create a copy of them prior to moving your FME Server instance. It's also very important to know that if you're upgrading between versions of FME Server, often the structure of these files change. So we never would recommend one-to-one replacing the file. The best practice would be to open the new file that has no configurations side by side with your old file that you performed all the configurations and make the changes manually. Often we do drop tags or we add tags, and if you simply replace the file with an older one, you do risk putting your FME server in an unhealthy state. So the first exercise for today will just have us briefly go over a simple backup exercise just to get us all familiar with the workflow involved. So first thing I'll do is go to my FME server instance. Once again, if you've configured for HTTPS, that will be make sure to add the proper protocol and the port to your localhost address. Again, it's important that we need to be the admin user. If we're not the admin, and particularly if we're not the FME super user, we won't have access to the backup and restore operations, and we will not be able to create a full backup. So I'm going to navigate to the backup and restore page. And here you'll see you have options of backup, restore, and you can also view the log file for these operations. So I'm going to go back to the backup tab. You'll notice that the file name will be populated with your host name of FME server. I believe this is just grabbed from your web URL. As well, by default, we put the current date and a timestamp, and also the build of FME server. You have a choice where to back up your installation. You can either choose to download it locally, or you can choose a different resource location. There is a good warning here that if you're performing a backup as part of an upgrade or reinstall, this whole directory here is removed upon uninstall. So it's important that you place your backup in a location other than any of the FME server directories if your end goal is to create a new install that is uninstalling FME server. So for our purposes, let's just choose the download option. That will just download it to our local folder, local downloads folder. So this actually starts an FME process, an FME job in the background. It gathers all of your information from FME server. It looks in the FME server database, grabs all that information, and it actually creates an XML file. And this .fs config file that I've now downloaded to my local system, it's effectively just a fancy zip file. So in here, if you change the extension to zip and open it up, you will see that there are a number of like a folder tree structure containing a lot of your resources. So as best practice, we see that the backup is now complete. We would want to view the log here just to verify that there is a successful message here and that there's no errors or warnings reported. So in step 3, it mentions the backup of configuration files. So the training manual suggests to also create copies of the server XML, web XML, as well as the CA certs file and Tomcat key store file. If you've completed all the exercises up to this point in the training course, these are the files that will have either been created or modified. So if we were going to move this FME server installation to a new place or upgrade in place, that is uninstall a version and install the most current version, we would want to be aware to back up these files. For our purposes, I won't have us do that in this part of the training course. As well, step 4 highlights how backing up the log files are important or may be important for you. I think it's a great idea to kind of keep that history of FME server between upgrades. Again, for the purposes of this training, I will omit this step here. But again, if you'd like to back up your log files, you can either do so by choosing from the FME server web interface. You can access the log files by clicking on resources in the left-hand menu, navigating into the logs folder. And here you can go into either the core, engine service, Tomcat logs. For each log folder, we do have the current or old, so which logs are being written right now. Every FME server restart, all the current logs are placed into the old folder. So if you come into here, see, maybe you want to keep this information, then you can simply just download these log files. Of course, if you want to download a whole bunch, doing it through the web interface is not very efficient. So I would recommend navigating directly to the FME server system share directory and backing up those logs. I'll just chat out this location here. So if you're working on the training machine, that is the directory for which the FME server log files are saved. Also very critical as part of the backup procedure is to verify your backup. We did check the log file, but if we were moving servers or upgrading in place, it would be wise to actually check that a restore of the file that we downloaded works. We have heard of a few instances before where while the FME server backup, that fsconfig file, was created successfully, for a variety of reasons, the web browser that a client was using actually stopped the download prematurely, so they had an incomplete fsconfig as a result. And then when they tried to restore after uninstalling their FME server, they unfortunately did lose a number of components. And in fact, they did have to contact support, and we had to manually hack that backup in order to save anything. So if you're upgrading FME server, the most ideal scenario is you are using a different machine or VM to do this. Perhaps you have just a DNS on top, DNS switch that you can change the IP to which users will be directed. That's no problem, of course, if you have a load balancer. If you do have to upgrade in place, though, you still can verify your backup. One way we can do this on the backup and restore page, we can go to restore, that's the restore tab. And then I can upload that fsconfig that I just downloaded here. So key thing is I wouldn't bother to check overwrite existing items, as that's not the intention here, but we just want to make sure that the fsconfig file we created is, for lack of a better way to say it, structurally sound. So if I drag and drop on here, FME server goes through that process. And once I see that green check there, everything's all right, I can also view the log to verify that the log doesn't have any hidden errors or warnings. And then we can observe. So one interesting thing to note here is version control. This is a beta feature for FME server, and that's something that maybe we can get into at the end of this course if anyone is interested. So we feel that is the best practice for the backup procedure, is to create your backup of the FME server components using the web interface, to manually back up your configuration files that you may have edited as part of any post-installation configuration. If applicable to you, you may wish to back up the log files. Again, this will have to be done manually. Log files themselves also cannot be restored. So the job IDs will reset once you install a new version of FME server. And then, of course, verifying that backup is vital. So we will require this backup as part of a later exercise, so please make sure that if you are following along in the exercises for the rest of the day that you have created this backup file. So we do have a few recommended types of upgrades. Upgrading to a second machine using a different host name, well, that probably isn't applicable to most cases. However, that is the most easy way to upgrade FME server. There's very little extra things to worry about. Upgrading to a second machine using the same host name, again, that perhaps is more applicable to a lot of scenarios. That's a lot easier to do. Either of these first two methods will ensure zero downtime of your FME server, or perhaps just a little blip when the traffic is redirected to the new install. However, if you upgrade in place on the same machine, be aware to verify your backup first, as there will be no going back once you uninstall if you have not created a backup, an fsconfig file that is that has been verified. Upgrading in place on the same machine also does require a period of FME server downtime, and that could be anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours based on your amount of post-install configurations and your experience administering FME server. Now, I should note here, you can perform just an FME engine only upgrade. So if you're working in the same major version of FME server, say right when FME server 2017.1 was released, you upgraded, and shortly after you realized, oh, there's a .1 update, and now even there's a 2017.1.1.1 hotfix that's out there. So the current build is 17652. Then now that's a lot of overhead if you're upgrading every time we have a public release. You can upgrade only the FME server engine component. If you look over the change log and there's nothing that, there's no fixes or new features that are applicable to you for the FME server core or web interface, you have the ability to upgrade only the engine component of FME server. I did briefly mention projects yesterday. So in the FME server web interface, we have the projects page that's new. The projects allow you to create a collection of FME server resources. So I'm just going to do a quick example here. You can create a new project and you are able to add any item from FME server. You'll see the same selection of items that you would expect to have in a full FME server backup. So a project allows you to create a subset of your FME server. Perhaps you're only containering a single solution, maybe a notification workflow, maybe just a few workspaces. You can save this project to your local drive or to FME server. It also allows you to kind of work in a versioned type of space. So if you have iteration 1 of your notification workflow, you can create a backup of it before you go in and make some major changes, so you can always revert if necessary. Projects can be created on the user level. It does not have to be an admin user to create projects. The caveat being, if a user creates a project that has any users or roles in it, an FME super user must import that project. And that's just for security reasons, for we wouldn't want to unwillingly or unknowingly give access to our FME server if someone injected one of their own user accounts into it. FME server projects can be shared within your organization or with others. They're particularly effective when moving between environments, so development, test, prod, that sort of thing. Project works very similar. Once your project is exported, it's always the best practice to make sure that it can be imported again, especially if it contains components that you'll be changing. The project export and import are logged to the same file that the general backup and restore is. So if you view this file after importing or exporting a project, you will see the information recorded in this log file. The FME Server authoring course has an entire chapter dedicated to FME Server projects. if you would like to investigate that, we do have it available in the FME Data 2017 folder. If you're interested, you can maybe give Laura a shout on the chat, and if a lot of people are interested, we can take some time to look at it if we have any available left over at the end of this session for today. So that concludes this short chapter on migration and upgrades. Particularly, we just try and point out some best practices and some items that we feel are gotchas if you are not aware of them. So configuration files for FME Server need to be manually backed up. This is also applicable to the FME log files, not just your job logs, but also your system, core, engine, and if you're using the default web application server, your Tomcat log files. All of the FME Server components are backed up with the general backup. If you want to just choose subsets of these, you can look into using the FME Server projects. FME Server backups can be scheduled to occur, and you can choose the output location, whether it be local to FME Server or on a network drive. There are a few different methods of upgrading FME Server. Commonly, we do see people upgrading to a second machine using either a different or same host name. Upgrading in place on the same machine, it is important to be aware that you do fully verify your FME Server backup before uninstalling FME Server. As once you have uninstalled, if you haven't created any sort of file system backup or clone of your VM or file system, you do invite the chance of losing your FME Server configs. We do recognize that the current FME Server installer does require a full uninstallation to upgrade components. However, if you're only looking to leverage bug fixes or new features in the FME Server engines, you can upgrade only the engines, leaving your web interface, your database, and your core as they are. As a general best practice, I would recommend to only perform these type of upgrades in the same major version. So that'd be 2017.0. I would recommend to only have only .0 engines, so that'd be 2017.0.x. And the same thing for FME Server 2017.1. I would recommend to only upgrade to .1 releases at that point. There is some support for upgrading between .0 and .1. However, I would do that with caution. And we definitely do not support different year versions. So you definitely cannot place FME Server 2017 engines on a 2016 install. So our next chapter will be on scalability and performance. We'll look at ways how we can improve the performance of FME Server and how by scaling we can achieve that. So one great feature that's moved entirely into the web interface is job queues. Now job queues, you may have referred to them as job routing configurations in previous versions of FME Server. Job queues are a way for you to reserve FME Server engines, and you can send specific jobs or all the jobs in specific repositories to these engines. The idea behind job queues is by reserving an FME engine or tagging an FME engine so that only certain jobs can run on it, you'll ensure that your mission critical jobs will always have an available engine to run, and perhaps some of your overnight tasks, they can also run perhaps at a lower priority or be restricted to a smaller pool of engines for those who have multiple. So job queues in FME Server used to be configured through the configuration files. As I mentioned, we are entirely in the web interface now. And let's take a look through that with exercise 1 of chapter 5. So I'm going to navigate to my FME Server web interface. And to create and modify, manage job queues, we must have access to the engines and licensing page. So on the left-hand side menu, we're logged in as the admin user. Under this admin heading, we can go to the engines and licensing page. This is where we can see all of that licensing information, where we can update our license if we need. We can also manage our hosts. We can see all the different host machines that have or are serving FME engines to our FME Server core. This is where we can change the requested engines. The maximum number of engines is identified in the licensing section. So you can see here we are licensed for a maximum of 10 on these training machines. I can tune this up to 4. And shortly thereafter, you will see these engines come online. Similarly, you can decrease your count and they will disappear. So the job queue section is located down here. You will see by default, there is a default system queue that is created. All engines must be a part of at least one queue. If they are not part of a custom queue that you have created, they will be a part of this default pool. So following along step 1 of the exercise, let's create a new job queue. So select this Create Queue button, and it prompts you for a name. I'm going to call it Quick Translations. So the idea here is I'm going to create a pool of a subset of my available FME engines, and then I can tag any important jobs or jobs that are run on demand and the user is expecting a quick response. I can reserve a set of FME engines to run these jobs, ensuring that they're always going to run quickly. So our queue has no engines by default, but we can add some very easily. There's this pencil icon is the edit button. So if we select that, we now see it opens up the job queue for editing. We can give it a description. For quick jobs. And then we also can give it some engines. So one thing that maybe some of you noted there, I pressed that pencil icon again to close to save my configurations. In this current version of FME Server that's installed these machines, it does have a refresh interval on the edit job queue window. So please be aware that approximately every 15 seconds, I think this window will refresh. This has been changed in the newer release of FME Server. So for your job queue, you can assign both repositories or engines. It is required for your job queue to have some engines for it to be effective. So I'm going to add in my engine 3 and my engine 4 that I just created by increasing my total of requested engine count. And I should mention that you can select different repositories here. So if I select my dashboards, then it prompts me, do I want to change my dashboards from default to quick translations? If I said yes, that would mean every time one of my dashboard workspaces ran on FME Server, it would always run on engine 3 or 4. For our exercise, we are just going to be configuring the engines here. So to make sure that our new job queue quick translations is operating correctly. We can test that with a workspace. So now let's put our authoring skills to use here. Let's open up FME Workbench. If you haven't worked with FME Workbench before, don't worry, we're not going to get into anything scary. You can open up FME Workbench, which is part of the FME desktop suite, by selecting this icon on the left. It's pinned to your toolbar on these training machines. So we'll launch the 2017.1 version of FME Workbench for you. If you're launching FME for the first time, you may have a pop-up. The pop-up will have some quick training that you can run through. If you've never used FME Workbench before, you can exit out of the window now, but maybe don't select the button that won't show it again. It's a great little tutorial. It'll take a couple minutes to run through. So I'm going to select the main canvas here. And to add transformers to FME, all you have to do is start typing on the canvas. I'm going to add 2 as shown in the training manual in exercise 3. It's a creator and a logger transformer, and just connect them together. So to start typing, there's my creator, hit return. And while that creator is still selected, I can start typing in logger, or selected, hit return. This is my favorite type of workspace that I like to create when I'm testing any notifications for the first time, or especially job queues, just something really simple that you know works. I'm going to publish this to FME Server. So now in FME Server, in FME Workbench, when we published FME Server, we handle the connection to FME Server with a web connection. This allows you to use the same credentials of FME Server in multiple different locations. So we can quickly create our web connection right now. I'll select Add Web Connection, where you're prompted for your server URL. That's HTTPS, localhost, and port 8443 if we followed that exercise. And our username and password is admin. We will be working with FME Workbench again in another exercise, so it is useful to create this web connection for FME Server now. Click Authenticate. FME Workbench connects to FME Server, and it grabs a token. So now our credentials are safe, secure, and encrypted in this web connection. For any future work we do with this FME Server installation, we simply have to select the web connection, no longer have to continuously enter in our credentials. This web connection also can be shared out to other users, knowing that your credentials will always be safe and secure. So I'm going to publish this to a new repository. So if you recall, repositories are just containers, folders for holding your FME workspaces. By selecting new here, I'm going to create a training repository. Description is optional. Once that repository is created, I can then place my workspace in here by selecting the next button. If you'd like to give your workspace a more logical name, feel free to do so. By default, we do have none to none, as our format will be what is your source and what is your destination. This is the web services page. You'll notice that these services do match on FME Server. If we go to the services menu, you can just watch here. So if you recall, we changed all of these URLs once we configured for HTTPS, and this is exactly why we did it, so that when we publish a workspace and register it to a service, it does record the correct URL. So I publish that up to FME Server. I get this direct link here to run my workspace. And I can select that to open up my FME server in a web browser. Right, so these machines are fresh. They haven't been configured with a default browser. We can do that, but without having to worry about finding out where that is, I will just copy and paste this link. So if you already have a session of FME Server open, you won't be prompted to log in, otherwise we would. You can also access this page by selecting the Run Workspace on the left-hand menu, selecting the training repository and then the workspace we just published. So to actually assign this job to that quick translations job queue, if you pop open the advanced panel, so again, this will be a user permission controlled item, we can select the drop down for job queue and you'll see the two available. I'll select quick translations and then I can run this workspace. This workspace doesn't do anything interesting. It creates a null feature and logs out that null feature, so it does complete very quickly. If I navigate to my jobs page, that's on the left-hand side menu, I'll notice that that job did run on my engine 4. If you recall, we selected engine 3 and 4, and it ran in the quick translations queue. If you select that job, it opens up the job details and log file, and then we can expand some of these job details, and you can see under the request data, you'll see that the tag and queue are set to quick translations. So that's very simply how we can create a job queue and assign a subset of our FME server engines. We can then run jobs on demand and assign them to these queues. If we're using any web services, if we're using a web application where we're leveraging the FME REST API, this is something that can be specified in that URL, that syntax to invoke a job. We can also reserve entire repositories. So if I select an existing job queue, we can see that by assigning repositories to a queue, that means the default setting is to run those jobs against that subset of FME engines. Once you create a new job queue, in this example here, I've assigned engine 3 and 4 to my quick translations. I can also freely remove 3 and 4 from my existing default queue. So that's something to be aware of as well. It does not automatically occur. That type of configuration should be done by yourself. So that completes exercise 1 on job queues. If you'd like to add additional FME engines to your instance, if you have configured a install of FME server, even if it's an express install, you can add engines to different machines down the road. Increasing engines increases your processing power of FME server. By placing engines on separate machines, you can also leverage existing third-party components or even just your system specs to process data. So you may imagine that if you have a lot of raster tiles to process, or you have some large point cloud data sets, maybe you have provisioned a machine that has a lot more RAM, swap space, processing power. You can add you can add the FME server engines to that machine. You can assign those specific engines into a job queue, and then any workspace that maybe is uploaded to your point cloud repository or that you tag with point cloud, you can have run on that separate machine. It also gives you the opportunity to install either 32-bit or 64-bit engines. The FME Server core can support a mix of both 32 and 64-bit engines, as well as engines of different architecture. So we could have an FME Server core and web app server running on a Windows OS, but you could have all of your engines installed and connected on a Linux system, Ubuntu or Red Hat deployments. Again, it is important to know that these major versions should match. So adding engines on a separate machine allows you to scale out that way and kind of give you the opportunity to add a better provisioned machine to increase your performance. Often what we do see is people are using their own database provider for the FME Server database, and that is completely acceptable to do. We support Oracle, PostgreSQL, and Microsoft SQL Server. For anyone who is planning right from the beginning to use one of their own database servers, it is a best practice recommended to still do an express install or still install the FME Server database, that default PostgreSQL that we install with FME Server. The reason being is that if you can install this database with your initial installation of FME Server, you can use that database to ensure the health of your FME Server installation. If at that point you realize FME Server is not working, it is a lot easier to receive support and identify the root cause of that error, rather than just simply starting with an external database. However, a lot of people do that, and we will still support you. Just giving you a tip that it is a lot easier with that default database to work with. And switching database providers at any point after, even for express installations, is doable, and the exercise upcoming will go over that. We were looking at or discussing changing the database provider for FME Server. I mentioned, just as a quick tip, if you would like to ensure the health of FME Server, it's recommended to start by installing with the provided default PostgreSQL database. At any point, for any type of installation, you can adjust your settings to point at an existing FME Server database that you may have configured on either your Oracle, your Microsoft SQL Server, or your own Postgres install. Again, by managing your own database, you do have full control over providing updates for the database itself. To change your database provider, 6 steps here. You would first back up your FME Server configuration. So we did that in an earlier exercise today. Then at that point, we can configure our database server. There are a series of scripts we have for you to run to create the schema necessary. The database configuration settings are controlled by a configuration file, so a text file that we will manually edit to reflect the settings of our new database. At that point, we would restart FME Server and then restore our configuration, because of course the FME Server database holds all the information about our security, our notifications, as well as pointers between workspaces and their resources. And then the optional step 6 to remove the dependency, disable, and or stop the previous database service. So let us work on these training machines to change the FME Server database provider. These machines do have an express install of FME Server. However, we have also installed a standalone version of a Postgres database. The FME Server default database runs on port 7082, and these Postgres databases are on 5432. So if you'd like to follow along with me, we are on exercise 2 of chapter 5. So step 1, of course, is creating that backup of FME server. If you were following along in chapter 4, we did that as part of exercise 1. If anyone joined us late, the backup for FME server can be completed in the FME server web interface under the backup and restore option on the left-hand side menu. You can simply just select to download your backup file, click that download button, and it will create your FME server backup as this .fs config file. So we do have the instructions as well in this step 1. So now that we have our backup, we can start to configure our database. So we do have to do some initial configuration to create the database container that will hold all the tables, all the schema necessary for FME Server Core to start reading and writing to. For this exercise, we will be invoking a series of commands, as well as accessing a series of scripts that have been pre-configured for us. These scripts are included with every installation of FME Server. They're included for not just the Postgres database that we're working with, but they're also included for Oracle and Microsoft SQL Server. So the first thing we'll do is to open a SQL shell window. This is for Postgres. If you do not have any familiarity with PostgreSQL, don't fret. As I mentioned, we have all the commands ready to be pasted in. So we can open up this by clicking on the Windows Start menu and then scrolling down to PostgreSQL 9.6. That's the version of the database, the standalone database we have. And opening the SQL shell. So that will open a new command window. And you can see we are logged on to the localhost server already. We are prompted, we first have to enter our username and password, I believe. Let's find out. Yes, so once we start by being connected to our server, and the first thing we have to do is enter in our username, Postgres. This is also the name for the root database. So on some systems, it may ask you for a password. The password is the same as the username, Postgres in lowercase, and this is identified in the training manual here. So I'm going to be copying and pasting these commands here. The first one we need to run is this PostgreSQL create user. You'll see that it is, if you follow the path, it's placed in the FME server installation directory. In the server folder, there exists a database folder. That database folder will contain scripts for either PostgreSQL, Oracle, or Microsoft SQL Server. So the first thing we do is run this script that creates a new user in FME server, in our Postgres database. So I just right-clicked to paste that in. The user that it creates, I need to actually log in here. And okay. This is not what I expected. One moment, please. Let's try this one more time. On my SQL shell localhost, that is what I want. Database, Postgres, that is what I want. Port 5432, that is what I want. So I'm just hitting return, return, return. Aha, here we go. Username, make sure that it is Postgres, all lowercase, and we have the credentials saved by default on these FME training instances. This is what your command prompt should look like once we are logged in. Now I can paste that create user script in here. Can you tell that I'm a database administrator, Laura? I think this should go on my resume right here. So once I pasted in that create user script, hit return, we see the response. It's created a new role ID, FME server with the password, also FME server. Not very secure, definitely something you want to look into changing afterwards. Next step is to create the database. So this script will create a database called FME server that is assigned to the user. We just created FME server. If I just copy and paste that command in here, we will see it creates that database and it grants privileges on that FME server user. At this point, it is very important that we now create the schema logged in as that FME server user. In the Postgres SQL Shell window, this identifies that we are logged in as Postgres.
Take a quick poll just to make sure people have those scripts.
Sure, yeah. Using that raise hand button on the GoToMeeting window, how many people are up to this step here? And remember, I tried to throw you off there by ignoring the prompts. All right, so I don't see very many hands going up. I'm gonna wait a minute here for everyone to log in. That's when you open up that SQL Shell window, it first identifies that you're connected to localhost. You can hit return. Then the database, it'll identify you're connected to the Postgres database. That's great, hit return again. It identifies that you're running on port 5432. That's what we want. We just hit return. It will identify that the current username you will be logging in as is Postgres, and we can hit return again. If you are prompted for your password, you can enter in Postgres, all lowercase, to log in. Once you have successfully logged in, you'll see this Postgres equals hash, where we can paste in that first create user. Again, I'm just copying and pasting from the training manual under step 2 of exercise 2. Paste that syntax, that string in, hit return. You'll see that we've created the role. We have created an FME server role. Then we can copy and paste in the create database command. Invoking that command will create our FME server database and grant privileges, assign the user to FME server. Similar commands will be invoked whether you are using PostgreSQL, Oracle, or Microsoft SQL Server. All these steps are fairly similar to creating the user, then the database, and now we'll move on to creating the schema. We actually need to log in as our FME server user. The easiest way to do that is to just exit out of this SQL Shell window, and we'll open up a new one. So I'm just opening up a new shell by going via the Windows Start menu under PostgreSQL 9.6, and at the bottom of this folder there is a symlink for SQL Shell. I'll have to follow the same prompts here. I have to connect to my server. That's localhost. I hit return. Here is where I need to type in FME server, because this is the database I want to connect to now. This is the database that we just created with our second script. Port 5432 is correct. We can hit return. And now this is where we want to specify to log in as that new user we just created. That user is FME server, where we will be prompted for our password, and the password is configured to match the username, all lowercase, FME server. Once you are successfully logged in, you'll see this FME server equals greater than. Now we are ready to create our database schema. This is step 3 of exercise 2. You'll see, just as a reminder here, it's very important we log into that FME Server database as the FME Server user. If you do not do this correctly, we will create the schema as the Postgres user, and we risk one of two things. Either we will not be able to access the database, or the schema is placed in the wrong database itself. Creating the schema, creating the tables is this third script here we'll run. Again, I'm going to copy this command here and paste it into my SQL Shell window. Make sure you're logged in as FME Server, right click to paste that in. And hit return, and we should see a whole bunch of tables and index creating flyby. This is creating all the database tables in our FME Server instance for us. Maybe I'll get a quick show of hands if everyone was able to successfully create your tables, your indices. Again, the same script will apply for Oracle and Microsoft SQL Server instances. All right, I will continue on here. So we ran those two scripts as the Postgres user, then we created a new SQL session so we can log in as our FME Server user to our new FME Server database. We just ran that create schema script to create all our tables, indices, views, and triggers. So there's a special step here for PostgreSQL on these database training machines. We have to change the traffic settings to allow now all in. Again, if you're creating your own or connecting to your own database, you likely have a different set of permissions to configure. So I'm going to navigate to this directory. Actually, it will be, yes, C program files, PostgreSQL 9.6. This is where our standalone Postgres install is located. So if I navigate with my Windows Explorer to C program files, we have the PostgreSQL folder, and inside is the 9.6. Navigate in here. And then I want to go into, as indicated in the training manual, into the data folder. And in the data folder, there will be a file called pg_hba.com. And this is the file that we need to open up in a text editor. So right click to open this up in Notepad++. Scroll to the bottom of this file is where we find this connection information. I'm just going to comment out what exists here. So we're going to be modifying the IP 4 and 6 links. I'm going to copy and paste the existing connection onto a new line, add a hash to comment out line 80, and I'm going to do a similar practice here under IPv6. You can also just simply copy and paste these lines here in the training manual step 4. What we'll be doing is changing the IP address from 127.0.0.1 to all zeros, as I'm doing now, 0.0.0.0/0. And for the IPv6, we'll remove the 1 and change the 128 to a 0. This allows all access to our new database. Once you have performed those two changes, you can save the file. And then we will have to restart our database service for these changes to take effect. Again, this step is required for these PostgreSQL databases on the FME training machines. To restart the Postgres service, I can click on my Windows Start menu and start typing in services to open or filter down to the services application. Opening up this application is where I see, as we observed yesterday, all of the FME Server Windows services. And in particular, we have this PostgreSQL service that is for the standalone database that we have just configured. So if I right-click on this, I can select Restart. And this step is very important for the changes that we just saved to our PG HBA configuration file. We'll just take a moment to restart, and then we can continue on with our workflow. I'm also going to leave the services window open for after I switch the FME server database, I can disable the default database that has been installed with the Express installation. So I will now be moving on to step 5. This is actually changing the database configuration, changing where FME server is pointing at to connect to our database. And this change will be performed in the FME common config file. So if I open my Windows Explorer, we have the directory we need to navigate to in C apps, FME server, server. So on my C drive, open up this apps folder where we have our FME desktop and server installation. Open up the FME server folder, and all these configuration files are located in the server folder. You may recognize some of these from the backup and migration pages where we identified that all these text files, if you perform any post-installation configurations, as we will be doing in just a moment, they do need to be manually backed up. The FME common config file we are interested in, if I right-click, I can open that with my Notepad++ or whichever your favorite editor is. And here is where we can set a variety of different FME server settings, but I'm going to scroll all the way to the bottom where we have our database connection statements. In particular, we want to look at line 162. This is the line that we are going to be changing. I'm going to copy and paste this into a new line. This allows me to add a hash to line 162 to comment that out. If I need to revert any changes, perhaps the database configuration didn't go well, perhaps we want to revert at some point, we can simply do so by adjusting the commenting. So now the beauty of this is we did install our standalone Postgres database to the same local machine. We actually do not have to change the localhost host name. We just have to change the port. So 782 has to change to that 5432. That is the new database instance that we have created. You can save this file now, and it's time to restart FME server. Once we restart FME server, we will now no longer be pointing at that existing database. We're going to be pointing at the shell, the empty tables of this new database. So if under the Windows Start menu, FME Server, we can select the Restart FME Server option. So I was careful to mention that this is now pointing at an empty FME server installation. And I will navigate to the web interface just to point out one thing in particular. If you navigate to your FME server instance right now, you'll notice this is how the page appears. What's going on? Why is it so blank? That's because we need to run a post configuration script. If you install a custom or distributed installation of FME Server and you're pointing at your external database and you log into your FME Server web interface and this is what you see, this identifies that you have not yet configured your FME Server database. We've created all the tables, but they actually have no records in them. There's a series of records we require in our database for FME Server to have its components up and working. So step 6 of the exercise identifies where the script is and we have to run this. It's important that the FME Server core and web server are up when we are running the script. Even though we have this empty shell of an FME Server, we do need the core running in order to run this script. I'm going to navigate to this location identified in the training manual, C apps FME Server. So I'm just going to go up one directory here and into the utilities folder. We'll see a series of batch files here. In previous versions of FME Server, we are required to run a series of steps. This still is required on Linux systems. However, for Windows OS, we now have one simple batch script to run. So as best practice, always run this as an administrator. I'm going to right click, selecting Run as Administrator on the Run Post Install batch file. It will take a minute or two to complete. What this will be doing is creating all of the default FME Server objects, the web services. It'll publish your default repository, create default notifications, create all your notification protocols. So it's prompting if I would like to stop my FME engines. That's fine. I will select Y for yes. Then the script completes. This is best practice. I'm just going to make sure all of my FME Server services are still running. If I navigate to my Windows services here, I can refresh. See that my core and engines still need to start up. So I'm going to manually do that. If I select the core, I can click Start the Service. And I will also start my FME Server engines. And note that we are running off our standalone Postgres installation, so I can actually stop or pause the FME Server database Windows service. So I'm just going to stop that right here. I see we have to change the dependencies, so I'm not going to worry about that right now. We do have instruction in our documentation, I believe, how to effectively stop that database. So I'm not going to worry about it for now. Just make sure that you start up your core and engines after running that batch file. So if we refresh our FME Server web interface, we can see things are starting to look a little bit more normal. However, if I come into my repositories, notice that I don't have that training repository. And if I go to my engines and licensing page, I only have 2 engines and I don't have my job queue. Why is that? Well, we actually still need to restore our FME Server backup. So make sure you're logged in as your admin user, which has the FME super user role privileges. And we're following along now in step 7 of the exercise 2 to restore our FME Server configuration. So remember, we're pointing at our new database. We've configured brand new tables. We've populated them with all the default items. Now it's time to restore our old configuration. So if I select the backup and restore option from the left-hand menu in the web interface, I can select the Restore tab where I can upload my fsconfig file. For this purpose, I will opt to overwrite any existing items so I can ensure that the configuration will be properly replaced. So that, if you had followed along in the exercises, will be in your downloads directory for the administrator user that we are logged in as. I can simply drag and drop this local host fsconfig on here. The restore will automatically start, it uploads, and because we had a fairly fresh install of FME Server, we haven't published many resources or workspaces, it was very quick. As best practice, I will view the log file to see that my migration did update. Which is interesting to see these fail to log in items here. I'm not too sure where those are coming from. But if I go to my repositories page, I don't see my training repository, which is not good. And down here, I don't see my other job queue. It's a very interesting occurrence that I did not expect, which gives us an interesting time to try and debug this. I'm going to try with the out override existing users. This will make for a very interesting recorded version. Yeah, no, still nothing there. Well, 9 times out of 10, this did work, and when I ran through the exercise in preparation for this, it did work here. So,
at what stage did you do the backup? I've got 2 people mentioning you maybe did it before adding the repository and the queue.
Oh, did I?
When does that happen?
That's a very good point. Laura mentioned we had multiple users point out that I likely created my backup before I created my training repository. So I guess is my user in there. Aha, there. So I do have that new user in there. That was created prior to the backup. So there we go. Create your backup at the right time. It is still interesting, all things considered, that we did receive those errors in the log file about a user failing to log in. So I'm not too sure where this came from, and that might be something we'll look into. Could be that someone else is trying to access my FME server.
Awesome.
It's possible. These are publicly accessible. You can access these FME servers from your own machine. They do have a public DNS. So how many people were able to successfully switch over their database? Quick note, if you did have any issues switching over your database, it's an easy fix. Just uncomment out your 7082 and delete your line for 5432 and then restart your FME server. If you did have any issues, we'd love to help debug what those were. But I will be continuing on with the training course. So again, if you did not create an additional backup as we did instruct in step 1 here, you will not have your training repository. However, you still should have your new user included as part of that backup. Just a reminder, if we were installing to a new instance of FME Server, we would have also required to back up those server XML files that we did for HTTPS configuration. And as well, you may notice that if we run any new FME Server job, this is going to run with a job ID of 1. So the job ID does reset. Oh, I have to change all my hosts here again. So if I run a workspace, it should go as job ID 1. Yeah. One thing I did notice there is I did have to come in here and change my services URL. I created that backup before configuring for HTTPS. So if you use that existing backup from yesterday, you may have to come back into the services and change all hosts again. If you created your backup at the start of the exercise, this should already be taken care of for you. So FME Server also has a variety of system cleanup tasks that are all enabled by default. These are accessible from the left-hand side menu under the admin heading, System Cleanup. You can see these are a variety of different tasks that will run. They are all scheduled to run on an interval. It is very important to be aware of them, as we do have utility tasks to delete old core logs, job logs, temporary data, email attachments, even your Tomcat logs. So by default, these do have some pretty high times, that is either by week or by month. You can disable any of these as you wish. Also notable on the system cleanup page is this configuration. It has a quick summary here that these cleanup tasks run once per day or as indicated in their task interval. We have a series of conditions we can set here, notably these low disk conditions. So by default, every 5 minutes, FME Server will check the drive that FME Server has its system share on. If that disk by default is lower than 20% or lower than 20 gigabytes, we run these cleanup tasks. If it reaches a critical condition, which is by default defined to be 10% disk space or 10 gigabytes, then regardless of the maximum age here, these tasks will be invoked. If we run out of disk space, a lot of FME Server services will not work, including things like data download. A lot of the notification services won't work. So please be aware that all these cleanup tasks by default run once per day, and they check for files older than a week or a month as defined per task. However, if we reach these critical levels, the tasks are run and they will clean up files regardless of the maximum age setting. And this is highlighted in the summary of the configuration page. Any of these, you can add additional tasks if you wish, disable and edit them as you see fit. That is all I will say on the system cleanup tasks. That does conclude this chapter 5. We started off clean. We worked with some job queues, job tags that did work out fairly well for us. We did run into some issues with those Postgres database configurations, notably with that SQL cell script and myself forgetting to create that backup. So when I expected to see my training repository, it wasn't there. However, I did verify that the new user did come in, so that backup actually did back up something, and that restore did work for us. Very important to note that FME Server does periodically clear out resources as defined in that system cleanup page. It runs those tasks by default once per day, cleaning out anything older than the maximum age specified in those tasks. If your disk space on the FME Server system share reaches a critical level, those tasks are run instantly, ignoring the maximum age setting. So we'll switch over to the final chapter before looking at some troubleshooting items. That is the customization. So the first thing we have are FME Server dashboards. FME Server dashboards. So FME Server comes pre-installed with 5 available dashboards for you to use. By default, they are not enabled. However, once enabled, they do run on schedule. The schedule can be defined, of course, by yourself. We get a viewing of the total number of jobs run per day, the total amount of time our FME engines spent processing. We list all the failures organized by workspace. Another dashboard will show you the total amount of time that jobs spent waiting to be ran. This in particular is a good indication if you may need to expand your processing capabilities by adding additional FME engines or perhaps scheduling jobs to run at different intervals. And we also show you the average runtime of FME Server jobs per day. Once enabled, this is a typical example of what your daily jobs may look like. In this FME Server, we can see that it's listed in number of jobs run. It does peak at this area. Having these graphical reports may be useful for you, and they are very easy to create. They do leverage the HTML writer. You may have your FME workspace author create some dashboards for you if you're only concerned with the FME server administration side of things. The FME server authoring course does look at how to quickly enable server dashboards. If you are interested, you can come into FME Server's web interface. The dashboards under the left-hand side menu has a quick link here to help on how to get started with dashboards. I believe I did allude to this before. 32-bit and 64-bit engines can be installed to the same machine. I feel that if possible, if you need to leverage, if you have a 64-bit installation of FME Server, typically people will choose that for the better processing power offered by 64-bit architecture, allowing a greater amount of memory to be utilized. However, some formats do require 32-bit, such as GE's Small World reader and writer. If you want to add 32-bit engines to a 64-bit install, or conversely 64-bit engines to a 32-bit install, I would recommend doing that with a separate machine. That way you won't lose any functionality. You are able to install 32 and 64-bit engines on the same machine. However, the biggest warning here, you do remove the ability to configure the engines on your engines and licensing page. So if at all possible, install different architecture or different OS engines onto different machines. We do support installing to the same machine, but however, you do lose some functionality. FME Server also supports all the custom coordinate systems and grid transformations that FME Desktop provides. Please be aware that you do need to provide these custom coordinate systems for FME Server. You can upload them to a common engines folder. I'll just quickly show everyone on the resources page, we do have a shared resource for FME engines. In here, you'll see we can upload coordinate systems, coordinate system overrides, even formats, plugins, transformers. If you upload anything into these folders, they're available for all FME Server engines. It's important to know that once you upload items here, you must restart the FME Server engine service in order for the engine to register the contents of these folders. Commonly, we do see people uploading coordinate systems or grid transformation files there. For using Python with FME Server, the behavior has changed in workspaces built with FME Desktop 2016 or later. We now have a workspace parameter for Python compatibility, and this image shows you an example of the different Python interpreters that we can choose. If you have Esri's ArcGIS Desktop or Pro installed, we can also leverage those Python libraries if you want to start using ArcPy in your workspaces. Previously in FME Server, we had to invoke some commands via the console. However, now we simply just select this in the workspace parameter, and we can have that process, the FME engines will pick up that parameter. Gotcha that you can have with the Python interpreter is once an FME engine starts, that's when it first loads the Python interpreter information. FME engines, as you may know, the process is continuously running. So if you try to run a workspace with Python 2.7 on an FME engine, the FME engine will load those Python libraries. If you try to run a workspace that leverages Python 3.4 immediately after and it runs on that same engine, the workspace may fail as the FME engine has loaded the 2.7 libraries. The best practice to get around this is to assign with job queues different engines that will utilize different versions of Python. That's the easiest way, I think, to get around it. You can also configure a restart parameter in configuration files. Once again, every time an FME engine starts up, that's when it reads in Python libraries. So if you're running jobs in succession that utilize different versions of Python, we would recommend to manage that with job queues. You can use R with FME Server, and the information here kind of reflects on an earlier statement in the training manual. Any configurations that you perform for FME Desktop, installing supporting libraries such as Oracle or R, the same configurations must be performed on FME Server. FME Server also supports adding additional shared resources. On the main resources page here, you observe that we can create new resources. We can either create resources that point at existing Amazon S3 buckets, or we can select to connect to network-based resources that would be our UNC paths. When we create these resource connections in FME Server and we back up FME Server, the files contained in either these S3 buckets or network-based resources are not migrated. Merely the connection information is retained between or contained within that backup file. So if you have any large data sets, I suppose it'd be recommended to connect or store them in Amazon S3 or in your network-based resources to ensure that they won't be included as part of your backup to reduce the overall size of your backup file. So FME Server also supports the database and web connections that are created in FME Desktop. For any that are uploaded, we have the ability to manage them in FME Server under the database or web connections pages of the web interface. You can create database connections in FME Server of all the different types available in FME Desktop if you choose to manage them that way. Similarly, once you start uploading web connections to FME Server, we will start to see new web services available for us to create. Out of the box, we don't have any web services added to FME Server until we actually publish the definition from FME Workbench. So it's very important to know if you're working with web connections, And we do have an exercise for Dropbox. And I think we do have time to run through it. Just pondering for a moment here. We will try and run through this exercise here. If you want to just follow along, that is all fine and dandy. I do have to provide some credentials here, so my fingers are crossed that we're not going to get any block security here. I know we can no longer provide credentials for Gmail because Gmail quickly gets locked down, thinking that there's been a breach to the account. As all our FME users are located attending these training sessions from places around the world, it quickly will shut down Gmail in particular. I'm hoping it won't do the same for Dropbox. What I want to highlight, what this exercise is created to highlight is that once we upload a web connection to FME Server, we're actually borrowing Safe Software's credentials in the web connection. And why don't I show you to explain this? So in FME Desktop, it ships with a variety of web services that work right out of the box. So if I open FME Workbench's preferences, the FME options, if I go to web connections and select manage services, I can see there is a variety of all of these web services that are available for use right out of the box. The keen eye will notice that every web service has this warning that the service definition is provided by Safe Software for demonstration purposes and ease of use. For production use, it is highly recommended that you create your own application to connect to. We can't guarantee that these connections will be available all the time. If you are running any production workspaces, it is highly recommended to create your own application, and we do provide links to documentation to do so. This is something to be aware of if you're running any workspaces, either in FME Desktop or FME Server, that are a part of your production workflows. So the exercise doesn't instruct how to create this application, but it does identify how we can configure that in FME Server. So I'm going to start with this N workspace here. I'm going to perform exercise 1 here. Let's not worry about creating the workspace. In FME Workbench, I will open that workspace. So if I select Open from the File menu, I'll navigate to my C drive. On the C drive, we have the demo data, FME data 2017, and we have all the completed workspaces for all of our training courses. We're going to go into the Server Admin folder and open up the Web Connections Exercise 1 Complete. It's important to open up the latest one here from just a few days ago, the FMW, not the FMWT. So here we have a simple workspace that has a creator to kick off a translation. We'll be connecting to Dropbox in this example, and then we just have a logger transformer just to spit out something. So opening up this End workspace skips over this create workspace step 1. So we'll move on to step 2, creating this Dropbox connection. So if I open up the parameters by selecting the red cogwheel of the Dropbox connector, we'll see that all we're going to be doing is listing all the files in our Dropbox account. So to create a new Dropbox connection, we can select Add Web Connection. And at this point, we'll be brought to this authentication menu. And important to note, so this Dropbox web service connection we're creating with FME Desktop is leveraging the existing credentials of Safe Software account. If you're ever doing production workflow, it is highly recommended to create and manage your own web app. So once we click Authenticate, we're brought out to Dropbox here, and where we will enter in credentials. So I will share out these credentials here. It's fmedropbox@gmail.com. And in just a moment, I will paste the password into the chat window. So not a very secure password is FME Server Admin 2017. I'll just copy and paste that password in, select sign in. That will go out to Dropbox, grab a token. The credentials are never stored in FME Workbench, just the token. We select allow. Yes, it's okay for FME to access our files and folders to get an access token. And now we satisfy the Dropbox connector by creating that new web connection. If I run this workspace, it will list it looks like there's 5 files in our Dropbox here. So we have a PGHBA, a web XML file. That's what the logger is here for, just so we can identify quickly that we do have some files there. Again, we're working with Safe Software's credentials here. We're going to publish this up to FME Server now. So this is the next step in the training manual. This is step 4. We're going to publish this up to FME Server. Clicking the publish icon here or selecting under the file menu, publish to FME Server, opens up the wizard. We've already created that web connection for FME Server, so we don't need to enter our credentials for our installation. Just select next. I'm going to pop this into that training folder. And then I'm going to leave the default name here. Select next. You'll notice here, this is where we can upload our web connection. We must do this for the workspace to run in FME Server. We also have this warning flag here, noting that this will need to be authorized on FME Server. So FME Server, we will allow you to run the same workspaces you create in FME Workbench for testing or demo or proof of concept purposes. But again, if you are running in production, please create your own web app and manage it yourself. So we can select next, register with just the job submitter, that's fine. And that publishes up the OAuth connection. So if I navigate to my FME Server instance right now, and if I try and run, let's see what happens when I try and run this workspace. So the behavior between FME Server 2016 and FME Server 2017.1 is similar. So we will be able to run this workspace, but you notice we have an error here trying to list the file because I believe we need to authenticate our web connection. So in step 6 here, we need to configure that Dropbox web service. So here we're going to actually update our Dropbox web service to connect to the app that I've created specific for this course. So on the FME Server web interface, if I select the connections on the left-hand menu and navigate to the web connections page, we'll see we now have this Dropbox connection. I now select Manage Web Services, where I can see all the different web services that are published. Of course, we've only created this Dropbox connection. If you select the Dropbox connection, then that will open the edit page. And notice that we have no client ID or client secret populated. So this is where we'd actually have to configure the web connection to connect to our own API's web app. So these web apps, these apps for the APIs are created outside of FME Server. Every web service has its own particular way to create it. I've gone through and quickly created one for the purposes of this training course. In the exercise 1 of the training manual, I list the client ID. So I can simply copy and paste this from the training manual step 6 right here to my client ID. And the client secret says is distributed during the course, and in a moment I will paste that into the chat window. So this is a more secure string, of course. And it actually, yeah, it doesn't let me copy and paste it, so I'm just going to quickly type it out here. So there is our client secret. You can copy and paste this into the client secret. I'm just going to type it out again. One important thing when you're configuring these web service connections is the redirect URI. So in my developer Dropbox account, I have specified this redirect URI specifically for this web app that allows FME Server to connect out. It's also important that FME Server is able to talk to the internet, of course, for these. It has a resolvable host name. So I will select OK to close that window. I can now go back to my web connections page. I should be able to authenticate this connection. So if I select it and click authorize, any luck here? There we go. So the Dropbox has been successfully authorized now for use. So if any luck, if I try and run this workspace again, should this time go through. So now we have a listing of those files again. So again, the steps we performed, we first created a workspace, or in our case, we opened up this existing workspace. Dropbox connector, we were simply just going to list the files in our Dropbox. Using the add web service connection, we authenticated our Dropbox account by going out to the Dropbox API, just grabbing the token, storing that token in the web connection. The Dropbox web service that we're using in FME Workbench does use the web app created by Safe Software. So when we publish this up to FME Server, we get a warning here that it needs to be authorized on FME Server. In order to do that in FME Server, we had to first manage that Dropbox web connection, entering in our unique client ID and client secret. Once we save that web service, we're able to authorize our Dropbox web connection by invoking this button here. And then you may be prompted to again enter in the Dropbox username and password, and then you get the Dropbox web connection authorized successfully, and that allowed us to then successfully run the job. So was there anybody out there who's able to achieve success with these parameters? This is the first time, if you want to use that raise hand icon in GoToWebinar, this is the first time that we have done this exercise to a live public audience. If I see one hand of success, I'll be happy. Right now I see 0. One hand of success. Huzzah. You could have also connected to your own Dropbox if you had your own web app also configured. So we have at least one So that'd be about 3% success rate.
We had one question about where you got the client ID and the client.
Oh yeah, that's developer.dropbox.com. For a limited time only, you have access to my Dropbox account. So yeah, it's a great question. It's different for every API. You have to know your API that you're connecting to create your apps. So under my apps here, I created this FME Server Administration, and you can see that we have an app key and the app secrets listed right here. You can also see I added in manually these redirect URIs that are specified in the web service on FME Server. So you may ask, why don't we do this? Why don't we require this for FME Workbench? Well, we typically see FME Workbench, you're invoking these workspaces on demand. If you notice there's an error, it's going to be fairly front and center in your log translation window. However, FME Server is that enterprise product. People create notification systems. People create schedules. They may not know that these workspaces are silently failing in the background if they haven't configured any email notification, for example. So we require people to create their own web apps for each web service for FME Server. That way people have full control and knowledge that they are running with these apps themselves. So if there are any changes to the safe software credentials, if you're running an FME Workbench, it's going to be fairly obvious that the web connection no longer works. However, if you're an FME Server, that fail may not be front and center for you. So this behavior did change with FME Server 2017. Previously in FME Server 2016, you wouldn't know that anything is going on in the background. You just think, hey, it just works. But actually there are, for every web service, a web app that we are connecting to. So in this chapter, we briefly mentioned the dashboards that are available, and I showed you in the web interface on the dashboards page, there's a documentation link for how to enable these for you. We can install 32-bit and 64-bit engines on the same machine. However, highly recommended to break this out onto a separate machine if possible. There's a FME engines resource folder that you can upload custom formats, transformers, coordinate systems. Any files that you want to be made available to every FME Server engine can be uploaded to this folder. For FME engines to register, the service must be restarted. The processes must be restarted. The FME Server Python compatibility is a little bit more streamlined. We simply set this in FME Workbench's workspace parameters, which Python interpreter we want to use. FME Server ships with 2.7 and 3.4 by default. To install any other Esri products, selecting that in your workspace will point to the correct DLL location using the path variable. Important to note, if you run Esri ArcGIS Desktop or Pro, if you want to leverage their Python interpreters, you must have that application installed where your FME engines are installed. Also, quick note that if you are working with multiple versions of Python, it's recommended to manage job queues to direct to certain FME engines. For once an FME engine starts up and opens up Python 2.7 or 3.4 interpreter, it will persist until that engine restarts, either manually or after a default amount of times. That's 100 successful workspaces. That's the default. Database and web connections can be managed and created in FME Server. Database connections can be created right out of the box. However, web connections you must first upload or publish via FME Workbench, at which point you are required, highly recommended, to configure your web connection with your own managed web app. At that point, you are able to authorize the connections and have your workspaces successfully run. So this leads us into the troubleshooting, and in a moment I will ask Laura if she would like me to echo any great questions we received. But just to go through the training manual here, we have very simple steps for initial troubleshooting. First, perform the verification step. That's simply running one of these default workspaces in FME Server. These are workspaces we know run. If these workspaces do not run, that can point to evidence of a larger error. If it's only your workspaces that run, perhaps there's something we can investigate with FME Workbench to determine why this is. We can always try restarting FME Server and looking for orphan processes. For a Windows OS, it's really easy to do. If you open up your task manager, you can see you're running all the processes of FME Server. It is completely normal to have multiple publishers and multiple subscribers running. You have one process running for each protocol. However, make sure you only have one process monitor core, one process monitor engine, and one FME server process running. Often there are times where, for unforeseen reasons, applications can crash and do not gracefully recover. The process monitor may open a duplicate instance of that process, and then we run into an instance where we have orphan processes, where FME server core has a handle on an existing process. It loses that handle, but it doesn't actually create a connection to the new one. So if you do have issues with schedules or notifications, look for your duplicate processes. The standard practice would be to completely shut down FME server, then observe for running processes. Windows, that can be done with the task manager. Linux, you could use various commands to list processes. The FME server log files are the great resource for further information. If you ever have contacted support with an FME server related problem, chances are we have requested some log files. It's good to know that for every notification protocol, for every web service that's drops in their data download, there is a separate log file. If you're having issues with a particular protocol or service, look for those log files first. The FME process monitor log files provide a really good general overview of processes happening with either the core or the engine. These are common files we will request. They're accessible both from the resources page if you have the permissions, or you can drill down to the file system itself in the FME server system share. Always look for these warn and errors in the files. For further, we have a quick page here on additional troubleshooting help here, but what I would like to point out is the Knowledge Center is growing to be an excellent resource. The entire FME Server Experts team recently revamped all of our troubleshooting guides, so if you select this link in the training manual, you're brought to the Knowledge Center where we list our old troubleshooting guide here, but now we have a series of new troubleshooting articles specific to different components of FME Server. If you open up an article here, you can see some basic troubleshooting tips, some common issues that have already been identified by other users or that we have fixes for. Most articles will also include information that you may see in log files that indicates your error is similar to what we have an answer for. Every article does list common questions that are related to the topic, in this case, Active Directory. We have other resources listed, and of course, if you can't find your answer here, you can ask a question to the FME Community Q&A, or there's the other support channels available, such as live chat, to contact us. If you have any specific troubleshooting questions here, we are at the wrap-up section of this training course. Thank you very much for attending the first FME Server Admin training course delivered via the webinar medium. This was a modified version of the course that was delivered at the FMEUC. Your feedback is highly appreciated. That's how we revise these courses, add content, remove content based on people who have attended the course. So please follow this link here to fill out the feedback form. I'm also going to chat it out. It's a simple survey. Be honest. Be as nice or not nice as you like to be, as long as any constructive criticism is appreciated. For anyone who has attended this course, Safe Software will issue a certificate that identifies you have spent the time to complete this course. If you have not received the certificate after the course ends, maybe by tomorrow, reach out to us and we can ensure you get it if required. We have a variety of other information available to you on the Safe Software website, not just troubleshooting stuff, but also you can look at our blog. We have all of our documentation available via our website. And we also do have a YouTube channel. If you're looking for some consulting work with FME Server, FME Desktop, we have a variety of partners throughout the world. We have a link to our website here where you can find a partner near you. So just to further tell you about the FME Knowledge Center, if you weren't aware, this is a growing place of knowledge. We have all these articles posted in the knowledge base, posted by employees of Safe Software. There's also the highly active FME community, where we encourage you to post how-to questions. If you're experiencing any issues, you may consider posting here. As our users are located in time zones around the world, and we operate and support only on the Pacific Standard Time Zone, you may find you are able to get quicker answers by posting to the community. All FME experts on the support team are active members in the community, so if you do have any questions, you will see our avatars pop up here and there to chime in and add in our thoughts. If you're looking for any improvements to either the FME Desktop product, cloud, or server, please visit the Ideas Exchange on the Knowledge Center, where you can suggest your own idea and also upvote other ideas that other users have. So once again, thank you for attending this course, the FME Server Administration Training course. I hope you all learned something. If you have any questions, Laura and I will stick around for another 15 minutes to answer them, and we'll leave the audio on, so if you want to listen in on some of the other questions people have, we'll be happy to echo them out.
I've got one question to start with.
All right, what do we got?
Could you go back to the web page for the Active Directory troubleshooting?
I can.
Maybe we should send that one out.
All right. Yeah, so I'll chat out this Active Directory troubleshooting page. And in general, we have a hot link, a dedicated link here for our troubleshooting guides here. I'll chat this one out. So it's using the bit.ly compression there, FME Server Troubleshooting. That will give you a list of all the troubleshooting guides we've created. These are live documents. They'll be continuously updated. So if you're a member of the Knowledge Center, you can come in here, click follow. And if you're logged in, you can follow these articles and you'll be notified of any updates. If you have any questions specific to these articles, or if you notice anything missing, feel free to add a comment directly to the article, contact us via live chat, or even ask a question on the Q&A.
Another question. Is it possible to run a bat file on FME Server, like a batch script?
Oh yes, is it possible to run a batch script on FME Server? I believe it is. I think through the use of system caller?
I think so.
Right, so in FME Workbench, we have a transformer. I'm just gonna get a blank workspace here. We have a transformer here called a system caller. So if you have any command line syntax that you can enter, you can open up a text editor here, enter in some commands there, and if this will run on the machine FME engine is configured to, or is it the core?
It'll be the machine where the engine's running.
Machine where the engine's.
Yeah.
The FME engine will invoke this command on that machine. So if you have the batch file local to your FME engines or network share that they've been configured to access via service account, yeah, you can invoke a batch script this way.
There was one question from a little earlier that I thought was.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So they were asking about, so you showed how to do this, the web connections for Dropbox there.
Yeah.
But if someone wanted help for another web connection, like Box or something else.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
So where do we find documentation on how to create these web apps? In the FME options of FME Workbench under the Tools menu, if you go to your Web Connections option here and select Manage Services, you can see all the available connections we have. So in Box in particular, if you select it, expand the external help links, and that should have a link. I guess if you have a browser configured, that'll open up a link to, let's see if we can copy. It should open up a link to the developer website where you can find information on how to create an app for this particular service and configure your client ID and client secret. And once again, that can be accessed via FME options, web connections, and then managed services. All these icons, just as a note with the world here, those are default, they're installed to FME. However, we also can go out to the FME hub where there's all these user-created web connections that you can download. So if you simply can select, for example, Instagram, if you want to connect to the Instagram API, and you can download that, it will go out to FME hub and import it into your FME desktop. So if you want to see the full list, you can go to hub.safe.com. So this is a user-driven community here where people can upload their own creations. If we filter by web connections, you can see there are a variety of user-uploaded connections here, primarily from people actually at Safe Software. And here we have another community member who's created a web connection. Just go out, they've gone through the overhead of figuring out how to connect to the OAuth and obtain tokens and such. You have full control to create your own web connections as you wish. Oh yes, there was something else I was going to mention. The version control. So you will see this in betas of FME 2018, but also in FME Server 2017.1. If you are an admin user, you have access to the system configuration option. This is where you'll start to see a whole bunch of new and exciting features come to FME Server. In FME Server 2017.1, we only have the version control feature, which you can test. In FME Server 2018, all the current betas have additional features that you can use. So right now we have version control. Version control has the opportunity to be a game changer, where we can actually track changes to our FME server installations. I actually haven't used version control myself, but we do have documentation available that Laura sent out in a link. I believe, I think there's a video also. So I'm just going to open up that page here from my GoToWebinar chat panel. If I scroll up, sent earlier about 9 o'clock. Right. Let's see here. Can I copy this? So this page here, we can send that out again. This page here will have information on version control, how you can enable it, and what it's all about. As this feature is still in development, we would appreciate any feedback that you have related to version control. It's one of our highest voted for ideas in FME Server.
question. Who's running the workspaces on server? So we use the job submitter. It's asking for a username and password on the server, but they also created a Windows account for the engine to log in as. So who's running it? Is it the person, the credentials that you put in the job submitter, or the credentials you put on the engine?
That's a great question. So in FME Server, sorry, in FME Workbench, there's a transformer here that you can leverage called the FME Server Job Submitter. To configure this transformer, you connect to FME Server in 2017 via a web connection. And the web connection here that I've created is configured for my admin user. So if I come in and configure any workspace using this connection, this is with my admin account, any workspace that is run through this FME Server Job Submitter will appear in the FME Server Jobs page to run as this admin user. If you have configured your Windows services to run as a service account, that service account is only used for network or database access. This user does not have to exist in FME Server, and if you're investigating FME Server logs, that user will not be identified in the logs. Only the user account that exists in the FME Server and that you have specified for the FME Server Job Submitter. So I hope that answers your question. If we've announced your question on here and it doesn't fully answer, please ask for any follow-up. We'll be happy to expand.
Oh, here's another question.
Yes.
Is there an example which shows how to create custom services for FME Server?
Right, so if you want to create custom web services, that is a great question. Let's see here. I feel like we have a Knowledge Center article. So the question is, in FME Server, we have all these web services listed here. But you might notice you have the opportunity to create a new service. So the question is there any documentation on how to do this?